Good viewer, you are watching Exert Us. This is because Exert Us makes you feel good, makes you feel fulfilled. You are enjoying this. You will continue to watch Exert Us for a long time to come. You want to subscribe to Exert Us, and you will. You will like and subscribe and share. You will tell your friends. Tell your friends about Exert Us. Your friends will come to like Exert Us, much as you are liking this right now, as we speak. Thank you for subscribing to Exert Us. See, that was easy.
Ladder every time.
I'm feeling it.
I'm trying not to. I tried not to feel it, and then it just kept feeling.
Yeah.
Steven's back with us. It's good to see you, Steven. How are you doing?
Doing well, thank you.
Dude, we're all wearing kind of like a pseudo-Mormon today, you know, like the black and white and then the white and the red. I feel like these are all okay colors. But white is always like the color of purity. It used to be the color of surrender, and then Al-Qaeda started using it as their flag, which I think makes it not surrender, as far as I could tell with their ideology.
Yeah.
We're talking about...
If I was to redesign the temple, these would be the sacred garments, okay?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I feel like they could use a lot more like Taiwanese magic symbols and like those weird Chinese roof pit. Like if every temple kind of like sloped at the end into these really violent points that would just pierce the souls of demons and they would get stuck on the walls. I think that would be good. We're here to talk about free will.
Yes.
Yes, we are.
We've been doing that a while now, and it's actually pretty great. I'm a big fan. I like the idea of emergent free will, also the idea of emergent Zion, which Jacob Hansen brought up. I think that connects to this because, like our last conversation, we talked about the idea that you might get more access to phenomenological diversity, and Zion is that idea of a place where people can have, as much free agency because they have as much responsibility as it takes to have that much free agency. But we also talked about the idea that free will might be an illusion, at least for the individual, right? That was kind of the sum up. What do you say?
Well, yeah, I'm definitely of the camp that free will is an illusion, that it's not real, that it's actually logically impossible and empirically falsifiable. I think there's tons of arguments that we can get into on that front. And so, yeah, I'm going to be arguing that, that free will, it's this fundamental concept that has been deluding us for such a long time. And there's aspects of it that are true. So it really comes down to definitions. And so I'm really big on getting clear on definitions. I have lots of thoughts on the semantic issues. So hopefully we can kind of come to some agreement on our terminology and kind of go from there maybe.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree with that. So I'm going to be coming from the other side, in particular with a Mormon theological or cosmological background to free will, which I think uniquely can answer this question of free will that has, as you said, plagued human thinking for, I guess, thousands of years at this point, trying to understand how it can exist. I agree. Also, it'll be fun to nail down the terminology because I think a lot of people are speaking past each other. But I think I want to go beyond, what the typical compatibilists will say is free will, and I think most hard determinists will disagree. Their definition meets the terms of ultimate free will, and I would agree. So I'm going to make a case that I think there is the possibility of free will in its entirety from like the normal common person's intuitive sense of the word. And so I think we'll play around with that. I like this idea that there's my idea might play into some idea of emergent free will, but the idea of emergent might look a little bit different in my cosmology since I don't think time and space is fundamental. So we can go into those places.
Sweet.
Nice.
I have go ahead.
I just want to say, Steve, me and Steven, we've discussed free will in the past, and in my opinion, he's got a pretty creative take to it. So this is going to be fun. And he also has this metaphysical idealism perspective that might get brought in along with some Mormon theology. So there's going to be a lot to this one. So
and I have ADD, so I just wanted to share that Don Bluth, who is Mormon and made Disney movies, made Land Before Time, which is clearly about Brigham Young. Littlefoot is Brigham Young. That's not quite related, but I think it could be if we wanted it to be. Titan AE is Starbase Kolob. Okay, and I'm ready.
Is he also Don Bluth that did Titan AE as well?
He did Titan AE. He did Fievel, American Tail. He did the Penguin's Pebble. I'm a big fan.
Wow, I did not even realize he was LDS actually.
Yeah, dude. He's 95 years old, riding around on a white horse in the Utah desert. Went to BYU. It's exciting stuff.
Wow. Okay. Good stuff. Yeah.
But yeah, what I really wanted to say in terms of free will is, there's this old hymn from the band Rush, and it says, "There are those who think that life has nothing left to chance, a host of holy horrors to direct our aimless dance. You can choose a ready guide in some celestial voice. If you choose not to decide, you still have made a choice. You can choose from phantom fears and kindness that can kill. I will choose a path that's clear. I will choose free will." So I don't know. I like them. Rush is probably secretly Mormon too. Keep going.
Yes,
yeah, so I think now I think it would be fine to let Steven kind of build up his argument, maybe kind of.
That's a good idea. Let's let Steve open up because you got to go last time. Steve's always polite.
Yeah, I can start to build up something. I think
if you like.
I put together a presentation this morning. I don't know if it'd be helpful to try to share here. Let's see if it's even going to allow me to do so. That would be sad if it didn't.
It will. I'll be happy for you. Click on the present button. And
yeah, it's doing that thing where I have to allowed in the system. Yeah, give it permission. Is it gonna knock me out? Let's see.
No, it should be fun.
Google use password. Let's see. Yeah, it's saying quit and reopen.
Oh, we'll do it for a second, and I'll play my Crabs Keep Evolving song.
Oh, okay. Yeah, give me a second.
Okay, hold on. Crabs keep evolving. You know, causality has occurred in more than 5 groups of decapod crustaceans. Crabs take the stage, it's been observed. Evolving into crabs like humans into nations. No one needs to tell you, yeah, that it persists. The urge to crabify exists. Is he back? Okay, cool.
Back. Yeah.
Crabs keep evolving, dude.
See if it works this time.
But do they have free will?
That's the thing. I feel like the best argument I have against free will is crabs. Not the venereal disease, but just the inevitability of evolution.
Okay. Tell me if this works.
I see it.
Yeah.
Nature of origin of free will. Yes, here it is.
Yes.
Wow, this is so professional. I love it.
It does look good.
We'll see if it lasts. Yeah, so I called it Nature and Origin of Free Will. The self-selecting. Oh, I'm getting a song. Is that coming from me?
Sorry, I gotta fix that. Sorry, I was gonna be like the nature of free will. Yeah, cool, sexy. All right, we're good.
Okay, we're putting in the background music. Okay,
we're okay. We're good.
Yeah, so the self-selecting origin of the universe, I think that's really what it's going to dig into. But I wanted to just start with some things some logic pieces up front that I think will help to understand where most philosophers land in this debate. So it gives us a framework to discuss this more easily. So I think one thing that that is important to point out up front logically is that all things, if we want to call them events or anything that we can recognize in reality that must have an explanation, they must either be causally determined or randomly determined. So that's the title up here. But another way of that's often phrased is that either things are causally determined or indeterminate. That's another way to say the same thing, because indeterminate just means it's randomly determined.
But what is random? Is random just unconscious determination, or
random?
Sorry, you answer that later if you want.
Yeah, so by random, and this is a good question, because people can mean apparent randomness, like flipping a coin, or even computer programs have the algorithms that are apparent randomness, but it's not true randomness in the sense of the full term. If you knew all the variables, even in a computer program, in flipping a coin, if you could measure every piece and the strength of somebody flipping it, right, you'd know the ultimate way that it would turn out. It's actually causally determined. It's not random. And so there's down here, I even say there's a question that true randomness may not even exist at all. So that's theoretical. Really the only place that true randomness may exist, if it exists, is in quantum mechanics. That in the collapse of the wave function, whether that is actually a true random process or there's some other process, which I would argue for, that we don't understand the determining factors of why it collapses into the one, into the one place from wave to particle that it does. And the reason this matters is in this question is if choice is ultimately based on something random, right, rather than the person's actual will being the determining factor, that person is not going to be accountable or responsible for that choice. Really, it's not their choice. It's completely random by definition. So that's important to recognize, because a lot of religious people will often throw that in as if it's some sort of solve. And when I present my next slide, you'll see that in the grid. A lot of religious thinkers often go towards this idea of libertarian free will, which is not really helpful, and I'll explain a little bit more why. And then another factor, determinism can be split into two sources, right? There's either the internal causality, or that which is happening inside your mind, inside your will, that is ultimately the reason for the cause of the choice. Or it can be something external, right? So we might say something like genes, or if somebody had a gun to your head, right? Those would be external causes that you are not in control of. And most proponents of hard determinism would say that everything boils down to something that's ultimately externally causal, and therefore there is no ultimate free will. Yeah, so I said, if causality is external to the end of the chain, we can't have total free will.
If you're trying to show the presentation, it's no longer up, by the way, if you want to do.
Oh, it's not.
However, you're beautiful, so don't feel like. But it might be useful for people to keep notes. I know that several people have said, including Rad Data 4, that this is their favorite Sunday school class, which that's pretty awesome, because we haven't even gotten that deep into it yet, and that's awesome. So yeah, let's get people notes.
Let me go ahead and share the entire screen then and see if that saves it better.
Okay.
Oh, that's going to give me an infinite.
I do love that too. I think half of the audience was here just for that. So
yeah. Okay, let me open this back up to presentation mode. I think that's it. So is it working now?
Yeah, perfect.
Yeah.
Okay. So let me go to this matrix. This is really the matrix where all the different camps that are arguing.
You hear that, guys? We're in the matrix.
So this is the free will determinism matrix. Those who believe in free will and don't, and those that think that reality is determined, or reality is indeterminate, meaning that there's randomness, at least in the variables. So those who believe in free will are going to fall into the compatibilist camp, which thinks that free will can coexist with a determined universe, which is the camp that I'm going to fall in, with a pretty big variation from the standard compatibilist argument. You have libertarian free will, which again is mostly the result of religious thinkers who mostly come up with this idea because God, as being the source of all things, must therefore be the cause of all of our ultimate choices, unless there's some intervening factor that's not, a causal down the chain. God can create us, but if you break the chain of causality, then it spares God the responsibility. But that doesn't really help in some sense, because it leaves randomness as the determining factor. Or even if there are variations of libertarianism that just throw the random in just to save God in their theology, but still have the actual choice be based on internally causal conditions. So it's really no better than compatibilist free will, other than that it tries to throw in this randomness so that God's not responsible. So this is a little bit like I would consider this more like maybe anti-evolution thinking, or flat earth, young earth, creationism type of thinking, that rather than where coming from a place of strict logic. So I dismiss this a little bit, but there's still a lot of people that hold to this because they don't see how God can be absolved otherwise.
Can I interject a little bit here?
Sure, please.
So yeah, I pretty much agree with everything you've said so far, but I do have a little bit of a different vibe or take on the libertarians, at least the religious libertarians. Just that I feel like most libertarians, at least the ones that I've come across, their take on free will is just, it's kind of underdeveloped, right? It's not like they haven't even thought about randomness, right? A lot of them, they're not invoking, oh, I'm doing things because of randomness. It's almost like they just have this idea in their head of like agent causation, right? And they've got this idea that instead of determinism and indeterminism, like this dichotomy, it's either, your decisions, they either come from either it is determined or it's not determined. They've got like this third category, which is like, well, my agency just makes the decision independent of this dichotomy.
Yes.
You know what I mean?
Yes.
And they haven't thought about how to reconcile it.
Yes.
And once you think about it, then you're forced into determinism or randomness.
Yes.
Yeah.
Except if you know what randomness is and chaos. Stephen.
Oh, Andreas! Wow.
Yeah, no, you're exactly right. People want to invent a third category because they don't feel like something can be determined, because I think they typically assume by determined that it means inherently externally determined. And so it's well, it's not that. So I can't, free will can't exist if it's forced from the outside. So there must be this other thing that exists but they wouldn't consider it random. But you're right. So I think the thinking hasn't gone that far usually, and they don't realize that that's tautology.
Even the emergent. Sorry, keep going.
Yeah, no, it's a tautology. It's either random or not random. Like it really is a distinct category. There's not a third option. Well, it's either determined or indeterminate.
The guys the people who are talking about ranged emergence, right? They're saying that you have increased emergence of possibilities, right? And so the way that you can compile and compound these possibilities are more and more diverse, but that still comes from this idea that randomness itself is built of building blocks. So you have building blocks, but you also have continued emergence. Like there's more and more things that can happen. So that's not untrue, but they are built on the same pieces that exist.
Yeah, emergence wouldn't even save anything though, because that emergence would either have to emerge from a cause that's either random or determined, right? So ultimately, down the chain of causality, you're going to be throwing randomness into that emergent system, or it's going to be a causal emergence. And so you can't escape that. I mean, either you're going to throw randomness in and you can call it libertarian free will, but what's going to matter at the end of whenever you have all of the choices, you're either going to, in that moment, have the internal variables to be able to select that choice, or, and that's going to come from, hopefully some internal variables, probably some external variables mixed in with it.
Satan, is that you?
Right. Or that choice is entirely random, at which point it's meaningless.
But the idea of random that's the problem. Like, people are taking the word random and misusing it. It doesn't mean something with a lack of a pattern, which is what a lot of people say. Oh, random is just something that doesn't have a pattern. No, it is the apparent lack of a pattern. That's very different. People not being able to pick up on a pattern doesn't mean that there isn't a pattern. This is why they call DNA junk DNA, right? They just don't know what it is. So it's kind of their own fault, right? So thinking that chaos is without pattern, that's why people are saying that there's a difference. Realistically, we're just saying that there is a divine pattern to randomness we don't understand.
So to be clear, there's two valid uses of the word random, which is the common use of the term, which is apparent randomness, right? Which is that it doesn't seem that there's a pattern. But if you were God, if you were to have all the variables, it looks random, but really you can understand it.
Yeah.
So that way that most people use the term is not the same as true randomness. And that true randomness is typically what they're going to be using in physics, because that is more precise. And it's important to distinguish between the two, because when it comes down to whether free will can ultimately exist, we have to speak of it more in the physics sense, because we're talking about causality.
Right. So in other words, true randomness doesn't exist.
It either doesn't exist, or perhaps it could exist in quantum mechanics.
I don't see how it could exist, but I'm really interested in that. If you wanted to explain that, if you could, I'll have to look into that.
Andreas, if anything could convince me that true randomness exists,
oh, you sweet.
It would be you, Andreas.
I saw where that was going.
Yeah. So I personally don't think it exists even in quantum mechanics, because I have ultimately a theory of quantum mechanics that actually arises from this idealism, which I'm gonna walk through that pattern of why I think that's a logical necessity. Not only does it answer the question of free will, but I think it's also a logical necessity that describes the universe the way that it is.
And it's why crabs keep evolving. Okay, I'm down. You can show if you want to present, I'm down.
Yeah, so I can keep going, but we could stop at any time and try to fill out.
That's what we do. Well, you just desperately try to get through a point, and we will interrupt you as much as we can.
Well, it's good. It makes for an interesting conversation.
No, I'm totally on board so far. Like, I don't really have any disagreements.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So I want to talk about, let's see if I can share the entire screen again and get our infinite mirroring. Let's see if it's working. There we
Another
go.
dimension, another dimension, another dimension.
Okay. So I think the real debates between philosophers, most philosophers end up actually in the compatibilist camp. And by that, I mean like 60%, not like some crazy number, or hard determinism. There are some people that do believe quantum mechanics, does introduce randomness into the universe. But this is where the real interesting debate happens, in my opinion, between compatibilists and hard determinists. So typically, like just thinking of people that are more common to have these type of public arguments, a lot of the new atheists like Richard Dawkins or Sam Harris that reject free will are going to fall into this hard determinism camp. Whereas you also have the atheist Daniel Dennett, who is a philosopher, and that's probably why, as a philosopher by trade, he leans towards this compatibilism. So which is to say, compatibilists think that free will can coexist with a deterministic universe, and they're going to do some differences of definition compared to the common intuition version of free will. And so I created a little chart over here to talk about what the differences between philosophical compatibilism would be versus most people's kind of intuitive definition of what they would ultimately mean by free will. And
Hey,
also, yes.
Sorry, Stephen. I have something to share real quick before you
go
move
ahead.
on.
Go ahead.
How do I get this onto the screen? Do you see the image I'm trying to share?
No, click. Oh yeah, now I do. Sorry.
Yeah. So this is the Phil paper survey, and this is the statistics on philosophers' opinions. Is that able to be zoomed in?
If you click Control Plus, it ought to be able to zoom in.
Yeah.
Also, there's a magnifying glass. You can click on the magnifying glass.
Whatever. Well, it doesn't matter. It's just a quick point.
Bottom right, magnifying glass. Bottom right there. Well, you clicked it. It didn't work.
Well, I don't.
I can see your screen, but I don't.
Is
you're
that
trying to
helping?
zoom in.
Sorry, I'm a stickler. I really want Seth to learn how to use his computer.
Yeah. So yeah, for compatibilism, we got about 60%. For libertarianism, about 18%. So 57%, 18%, and then no free will has like 10%. So libertarianism actually outdoes this no free will perspective.
That's interesting. That does surprise me a little bit.
Yeah, that does. Yeah, to 18%.
Yeah.
So
that's good. That was really helpful information.
You can go back to sharing your thing. Sorry for the interruption.
No. That was perfect. I knew compatibilism was at that, but I would have guessed that more of the philosophers would have been hard determinists after that. I didn't realize that.
It's coming now with simulation theory. This is also something I've noticed is no free will is something that a lot of simulation theorists believe in and are seeing as probable, right? Because the more you deal with computers, the more you recognize that if you have a random number generator, it's probably going to shoot out a number. And if you have a random pattern generator, it's probably going to shoot out a pattern based on these, red, green, blue, 1 or 0, and so these things end up becoming predictable, at least in ranges. And so then you have this idea of range instead of free will, which is like you have the capacity to be, as you can get as big as this, right? Like that's kind of what it is.
Maybe I'll just speak to it a little bit before sharing, and then I can share the screen again because I don't want to stare at too much text too long. But so on the compatibilist philosophical argument, there's a little bit of changing of definitions going on, I think, from what most people would feel comfortable or feel like they think is ultimately free will. And I think that's why, in some sense, the hard determinists are being somewhat honest in trying to deal with what most people define as free will. So the compatibilists will say, okay, you're born, you eventually have this thing that you're calling you. You're calling an agent, and they're going to start at those conditions and just say, okay, if we're willing to accept that there's a you, even in a materialistic, atheistic universe that's going to have causality down the chain that created an initial you, it created the initial conditions of an agent, they're just going to say, okay, if you can call that a you, then we can also, we're going to just say that's an agent and that's a starting point. And from that starting point, this agent is going to have different things going through his or her mind. Even an animal, to some level perhaps, has thoughts going through their mind. And according to their own nature, they're going to, if they are not being constrained or forced by, with a gun to the head or some other external cause, they're going to be able to weigh according to their own thoughts and desires and nature, which is the will, and they're going to be able to express according to their will, right? So the will is free. It's freedom of the will. And so I think any definition of free will is going to include that. And that's what compatibilists will say is, that's ultimately compatible with determinism because it's coming from inside the person. If you're going to say there's such thing as a you, then that's sufficient to say, okay, we're going to take the beginning as you, and then we'll allow you to make choices within your nature, and that part is free. So I think most people will be happy and agree with that. But what the hard determinists will come along and point out is, but that person had nothing to do with those initial conditions. They did not get to choose their own nature. They did not get to choose their own genes. They didn't get to choose their environment. And so everything that's going on in those internal conditions is ultimately a result of all the external conditions that came before it. And so how can you say that those people are truly free in the ultimate sense, because they are essentially a wound up robot, and yes, they're able to have these thoughts running through their mind, but the thoughts that are running through their mind was because they were wound up as a basically a program clock, and they're just running out the system. And so compatibilists will even agree that, yeah, that's what's happening, but we think that is free will, because those internal conditions are not being forced in one direction. They have different choices, and the nature of that individual gets to choose according to its desires and according to its nature, and that's freedom sufficient to call it free will. So I'm glad that, Seth, I see you nodding and agreeing with most things that I'm saying here.
Yeah, I agree with how you're framing it. I'm wondering, do you subscribe to this perspective on free will?
I think that compatibilist free will is partly true, and I sympathize with it, but I don't think it's sufficient to pass the bar of free will in most human beings' intuitive sense of what they actually have. They don't think that they're wound up clocks that are now playing out their natures, right?
Exactly.
They think they get to choose who they really are.
Yeah, what about like the Copenhagen interpretation, right? Like the idea quantum mechanics don't really present themselves until they've shaped into, subatomic particles don't really present their potential until they've shaped themselves into atomic particles, right? So in also a sense, it's kind of the Mormon idea, like you become a god, so you have the potential to become all of these things. Like, so even though you start off with some initial conditions, those initial conditions are not stopping you from reaching all sorts of potential. So you also have this thought of Spinoza's God. This sounds like Calvinism, and I don't really want to. Don't do it. Don't give them any credit. But the idea that Spinoza's God, there's like St. Thomas Aquinas' first unmoved mover. Everything is being moved because of the mover, and so the first free will pushes into action things, which we are part of this grand schism from that first event. So we have free will in range, but it's based on the will of something that's come before us, and our will affect things that come after us. So we do have some amount. I mean, I don't mean to say compatibilism either, but right, like we do come from initial conditions. We have to account for that somehow.
So I think this is where I need to kind of bring in my perspective a little bit, so we can start framing a little dialectic here.
Yes.
So I agree with what Stephen was saying, is that for me, one of the most important aspects of the free will concept is basically, I am not a robot, right? When religious people are talking about free will, they're not saying, oh, I robotically do all these righteous things, therefore I deserve heaven. That's not what they're saying, right? they think that there's some actual internal responsibility that makes them earn heaven or hell. And so when the compatibilist says, yeah, robots have free will, I'm like, you're being confusing with language, because nobody means I am a robot when they say I have free will. You know what I mean? So like, we just need to subtract the word free and it solves the problem. Robots can have a will, right? The robot, it goes and accomplishes its goals. This robot has the goal of, I don't know, like Amazon robot is like moving books. It's like, oh, it's accomplishing its goal of moving the books. It has a will, but it's not like a free will that it's just doing whatever it wants. It's deterministically following a path of, the programming, and it accomplishes the goal of its programming.
I mean, we're definitely robots, right? Like robot is just a Slavic word that means job, right? Like, so menyo robota, like my job is, so if you say a traffic robot, right? Like in South Africa, a robot is the traffic light, like that changes colors. They just call it a robot. So it's a job that's being performed. We have a job. We all have jobs, even maybe like divine, in order biologically to reproduce or something like that, or to like do something in this world. So we are robots on top of having the potential for choices. And I think robots do have free will and range. Also, like you look at a Roomba, right? And a Roomba is able to like go all around the house. It kind of like measures out the house. The first day of a Roomba is very different. Before it decides how to do its job well, it's exploring and it's trying to find, all of its boundaries. And once it knows its boundaries, it starts to become more and more efficient.
So one piece that I'd throw in, though, that maybe is, I think most compatibilists would say is still necessary is I think that consciousness is a necessary part of the equation, so that there can be this internal dialectic of what the ultimate desires are to be manifest. And I think most compatibilists, not being necessarily religious or religious, would probably, I would imagine, would surmise that robots could eventually attain that, because if consciousness, arises from a causal system in a way that we don't know how, right? The hard problem of consciousness.
Robots could attain what again? I missed that.
I said, I think most philosophers would think, at least those who accept the materialist worldview, since we attain consciousness through material, I think most philosophers would think that it's possible that robots down the line would attain consciousness in the same way that we have. But I think that consciousness and ability to weigh pros and cons, even though it's a deterministic system, is still a necessary part of what would be called freedom of the will, because you need to have the will part. And I think a will implies the consciousness of the agent to have that desire.
So you agree that a will requires determinism and that a will requires consciousness? Is that kind of how you're framing it?
Yes.
And,
I think it just requires memory. So like, I think DNA and a lot of these we should look at primitive life as well, and how it has a will to reproduce, to survive, to evolve, like to mutate, to grow, to accumulate, and to cooperate. Like these things are not just emergent. We see them at the earliest level. And the only thing that seems emergent about them is the efficiency, and the efficiency becomes better with memory. So memory is more important, I think, than we give it credit. Like biology is just recording genetics and then exploding them and then keeping records of them, and it's a tape record machine. So by knowing things, it's able to predict things, and it's able to make more choices. So in a sense, AI, has all of the capacity to be a conscious system, as long as it's able to use things in nature. And we think of AI as being a Roomba, but it doesn't have to be. I always like to think of it as university education. I think university education is thousands of years of humans designing a way of thinking that is artificial and installing it, right? And then it's been in humans, and now it's been in books, and it's been in machines, but that's part of this thing. The machine thing is only a little bit of AI. AI will be using more and more neural links in humans to process data. And so as it gets more and more powerful, consciousness is just something that will be included in what we consider to be AI. Like right now, we're just looking at it as being a mechanical system. And so mechanical systems have those limits, but that's not an inherent limit of a thinking process.
Yeah, I have to both. I don't know. I have to both agree and disagree. I think consciousness can be available, but not in the typical sense that people think it would happen. I don't think it's a mechanistic system. So that'll eventually go into my idealism, right? I don't think consciousness is an emergent phenomenon. I think it is the base of all reality.
I do agree with that too, though. I think it gets more powerful, but I do think it's I think energy is the fundamental, like consciousness, the fundamental. Geist is probably the fundamental. Seth doesn't, though. Let's hear about it.
Well, I might not be that far off, but I thought I heard. Did you say that free will is not? What was the word you used? Mechanistic, or
consciousness? He said it was not mechanistic.
I thought he said both consciousness and free will are not mechanistic. Is it both or just one or the other?
Consciousness does not arise from a mechanistic system.
Right.
Let's say.
What about free will?
Free will is a feature of consciousness that also predates any mechanistic system.
I agree with that.
In my worldview.
Okay. So I think what's the most important thing to do now is probably to figure out what we're talking about when we say free. Because I already put forward my stance is that free cannot be the same as robotic. Yes. Andreas thinks free is compatible with being robotic.
That's true.
And I want to know what your freedom, because it seems like you agree with me, Stephen, but you think the freedom comes from something else.
That's correct.
That's what I'm curious about.
Yes, that's correct. Yeah, I would agree with you that a Roomba for me is not something with consciousness. Inherently, that's something that's not, at least it's not having an internal consciousness, making choices with that consciousness. It might arise from other conscious systems. So it's not having a will that's free to make choices like we are. So yeah, I would say that free will arises from a very separate system. And I'd have to start digging into that, but whenever we're ready to go to that level of the conversation, we can do that.
Yeah, I've said before, I think just really quickly that I think God has free will, like the idea of like limits emerging from free will makes more sense to me than emergent free will out of a limited system. So it makes more sense that free will would create limits, and so that we are living in a system of perpetuated limits because of the free will, not the other way around.
Yes.
But you have to understand Andreas's perspective on God.
There must have been a lot of glue involved. I don't know.
Andreas's God is not the agent of the Old Testament or New Testament. Andreas's God is this combinatorial explosion of infinite many worlds interpretation possibility. It's a very interesting definition.
Maybe. I would argue that the same thing that the Latter-day Saints go for, the idea of an objective origin of everything, is what I'm talking about. And I think that's also what Christ was talking about. And that when we get into Deuteronomist nuances of whether or not God is this Abrahamic or Dharmic thing, that we're kind of missing the point anyway. And so we should be looking for what we really think God is, which is something that's outside of time. And that as we look at creation, it's creation's relationship with the creator, and the creator is something that's outside of time. So these ideas that we talk about, like, they make sense so long as we try to put God into this. We can't throw the baby out with the bathwater. We can't say, okay, God is a single parent who writes books, but we also have to think, what is omnipotence? What is omnipresence? What is free will? And if you imagine something that has all of those things, then you're kind of getting the idea, like, you're kind of getting an idea of what God could be, what that really is.
Yeah, and I imagine if we get down to it, my description of God is going to align with a lot of the things that you're saying. I think it would be compatible. I've read the Bhagavad Gita once. I've been rereading it lately, and one thing that stuck out to me lately, it's an amazing book. one of the things that stuck out to me, now I'm even forgetting, I think it's Krishna that's the main god, right? In that book. Krishna is speaking, and I don't know why I don't like store away names, but the Arjuna, I think, the guy that he's speaking to throughout the book, asks the question, there are people that worship the formless God, and there are people that worship the formed God. Which is correct? And the answer is they're both correct, because I have both my formless being, and I also have my incarnated manifestations. Essentially, I'm of both nature, and that's something that in my own theological thinking that I've essentially come to believe. And perhaps down this conversation we're having, I will open up to you how I believe that the formless God exists, that's spoken of in I feel like a lot of world religions kind of go towards that formless ground of being God, and how that reconciles, with I think is the Latter-day Saint or Mormon theology through Joseph Smith, does, I think, superior to every other theology that I've come across, which is to understand the formed God or the embodied God, and how that plays out in the overarching, if you want to call it, plan of salvation or the theology of reality. I think it does a really good job of that, but I would hope that in the system that I might relay out to you, to show how the formless God and the formed God of Mormonism are actually one and the same thing.
Yeah, I would already agree before I even hear it, just because if looking at like Vedic scripture, on top of the Jesuit Ignatius interpretation of God, which again, this idea that God can be all things, but if God's being all things, then it makes it impossible for Christ to really be fully restrained to the flesh, unless God chooses to do that, right? So God has to essentially have the free will to limit themselves, and there's just more and more examples of how Avatar, the idea of Avatar in the Hindu pantheon, really does fit with the Latter-day Saint interpretation of there is form, there is body, and there's also formless. So I don't know. I don't think it's that crazy, Seth.
I've got
am.
kind of based on what you got, we're on a tangent, and now I have to just extend the tangent further, because thank you guys.
Thank God we're here.
I've been talking with a couple people about Jordan Peterson's theology lately.
Yeah.
And like,
if he only latched on to crabs instead of lobsters, the dude would have been part of the church by now.
He messed up big time, right? Now, I think what you guys, like, a lot of people think Jordan Peterson's like an atheist or an agnostic. I've been convinced for a long time he's totally a theist.
Yeah, he's a soft Jesuit. He does that bothers me. The only thing he does that bothers me is he'll quote Teilhard de Chardin, the most important Jesuit philosopher, physicist of all time, and never say he's quoting him. I think that's called plagiary, actually.
Oh, Andreas is so offended.
It's one thing, and he's been doing it for years, and it's the only thing.
That just gets under your crab shell.
So bad.
It? But yeah, I think what you guys described is very similar to what Jordan Peterson thinks. That this kind of like the formless and the formed deity. Jordan Peterson has this very metaphysical, abstract conception of God.
He stole it all from Teilhard de Chardin. The quote is, "We are not spirit. We're not humans having the spiritual experience. We are spirit having the human experience." Right? Everything he says comes from Teilhard de Chardin. Everything good he says comes from Teilhard de Chardin. I don't mean that like to diss Jordan Peterson. I just mean like if anyone's like, wow, they should really read where it comes from, because there's so much there, right? Sorry.
Right. So like, in my opinion, Jordan Peterson, I believe that his opinion of Christ is that Christ is an avatar of this metaphysical God. You know what I mean?
Yeah, the Omega point.
I think he has that type of theology.
Yeah.
Here you go. It's called the Christogenesis. And so the idea is, again, this is Chardinian, that you have cosmogenesis, which leads from, from spirit into birth of matter, right? Biogenesis into birth of life. Neogenesis, new genesis is mind, birth of mind. Christogenesis, birth of spirit. However, the Omega point, which is the emergent evolutionary progress of being, right? We're all getting to this point of Zion or whatever we're talking about. That's called the omega point, because it's where all horizons lead to this finite thing. Christ, God, is already there, right? Anything in time, God is outside of time. So our final point, right? Anything that we could reach is already the omega point, is where God is at. But God is also before time. So everything we're doing is leading back to God, right? So there is kind of this idea of evolutionary. Oh, we lost Seth.
We lose Seth, yeah.
He's probably just like, that's it. I wanted to talk about Jordan Peterson. No, he'll be back. I do think, though, that people really like should latch on to Chardin more. I think it's probably the most missing piece for a lot of people, because this idea of an omega point of evolution that comes from spirit, that seems like what we're all looking for anyway. And
yeah, it sounds a little bit like the concept of, well, either like Zion, like you pointed out, or you could think of it in terms of like theosis too.
Yes, both. Absolutely. Because the idea is also that we all are supposed to become more like Christ. We are supposed to become part of the Christ thing, which is very, like, he nearly got excommunicated from the Catholic Church for saying this stuff. The only reason it was okay was because Julian Huxley, Aldous Huxley's older brother or father, I forget, published his works, right, outside of the church. But he was essentially like silenced for years about this stuff. And they sent him to China, and they tried to just keep him quiet. And he accidentally discovered the Peking man, which was like a missing piece of evolution. So he's like, look, there's so he's like probably the most in 20th century grip between science and spirituality. But because he was part of the Catholic Church, no one was allowed to know about him for a long time, unfortunately.
Wow. Yeah, I honestly didn't know about it myself, although I'd heard the quote you shared. I just didn't know that they came from him. So.
Oh, Seth, are you gonna make it back, Seth?
I hope so. I wonder if it was like a computer actually died or something.
Well, if you wanted to, do you want to like you can present something lightly for? No, he's back. It's cool. I was literally just gonna make Steve tell me a joke. I was like, do you know any good Brigham Young jokes? But
yeah, sorry about that.
All right, keep going.
My grandma had one for me.
She had a Brigham Young joke? Really?
Yeah.
What is it?
So I say that something like bring 'em young and bring 'em often, something like that.
Oh my gosh, your grandma did? Your grandma's based grandma.
Wow.
She was funny. She always had, I've had jokes like that, and she was LDS to the end of her life. She died not that long ago. But everybody loved her. What?
Did she ever drink Postum?
Probably. That sounds about right.
So when I was working at Timcast, they were trying to make coffee, and I was like, but I don't drink coffee. And they kept trying to push coffee. So finally I ordered a bunch of Postum, which is like the Mormon like wheat brand drink that they make that kind of is like a fake coffee.
Yes.
And and the only people who drink that apparently, like, and the only reason they still make that is because like everyone has a 90-year-old grandmother if they're Mormon, because they, got to give them that Postum.
Yeah, I know there was something at least like that. I think it was actually Postum, but there was that thing that was so gross to me. But
based.
Okay, so I guess with Seth back, maybe I can. Is now a good time to kind of dig deeper into that fundamental?
It's always a good time to dig deeper. Yeah.
Okay. Let me try to share my screen again.
For sure. And you can just like, when it's on, you can just turn on and off like the share stage button there. Like you don't have to like stop screen share if you want.
Oh, really? Share stage. Where's that button?
Well, just once you get it shared, I'll show you.
Okay. So I'll share. We'll get the.
So this screen itself, I just added here. If you click on, you see where your face is, there's the button. You can add and remove it just by clicking on the picture there. Do you see that?
Clicking the picture, I see. Oh, remove from stage. Oh, that's my picture.
Yeah, you can remove your screen from stage if you want to, I think.
Okay, let me see.
Doesn't really matter, but
it's here. See, I see this hide button. Is that it? No, I don't know.
Oh, it doesn't matter. Yeah, I think as long as it works, it works.
Okay. So just real quick, I think Seth seems to agree with this, that, this philosophical compatibilism where we're still robots is not sufficient enough. So in addition to what the compatibilism offers, although I still consider a form of compatibilism, just not the typical one, I say that also my nature is not externally or predetermined by another source outside of myself. Free will is to be free to choose according to our natures, which compatibilists already have figured out. But we also need, and we determine our own nature itself. So in this way, we can be entirely accountable for what we are and what we choose to do. An independent agent, you, really exists. And so I want to make a case that that is how reality is. And, particularly Mormon theology hints very strongly to providing a solution for this. And I'll dig deeper into that. So Mormonism's unique solution to free will. These are a couple Joseph Smith quotes. I forgot to italicize this one, but these are both Joseph Smith and the King Follett Discourse, and it's full of quotes that are really similar to this. I just chose these two.
You want to try to full screen it so we get the quote a little bigger?
Yeah, sure. Let's do that.
Sweet.
Okay. God never had power to create the spirit of man. God himself could not create himself. Intelligence exists upon a self-existent principle.
Wow. Where is this from?
King Follett Discourse.
Wow.
Right down here, April 7th.
This is like Sweden. This is like Swedenborgian to say. That's really interesting.
Yeah. And then second, this and it's full of these types, like King Follett Discourse and then Sermon on the Grove, secondary one in 1844. Those two really lay out this idea. So the second quote: the mind of man, the intelligent part, is co-equal and co-eternal with God himself. I know that my testimony is true. So that was pretty brutal. Like for even modern LDS people to hear that, like Joseph F. Smith, when he read this and was compiling teachings of the prophet Joseph Smith, he actually removed co-equal and said that must have been mistranscribed, that we can be co-eternal with God, but we can't be co-equal.
Yeah, that sounds pretty blasphemous off the top.
Yeah, I think for most,
without context, but it's not. I feel like if you're an evangelical Bible thumper and you don't know what Elohim are, then yeah, that might be confusing.
Yeah. From the
we know what the Pharisees did to people who said crap like this.
That's true. What they're doing today. Oh my gosh, careful, Steve.
Yeah, so I can understand from the typical maybe Protestant Christian perspective that can look very blasphemous and be even uncomfortable for people that might not understand a deeper theology. Like, what's this about? Co-equal with God? That was,
read it like a Hindu. Like Krishna never had the power to create the Narayana of man. Like,
yeah, yeah.
Vishnu himself could not create Vishnu. Right? This is. The thing is, when we look at it, it gets really weird because evangelicals have wanted this biblical reduction where it's all one character, and they've like tried to reduce all the angels even to just being, a couple characters, and it isn't that simple. There's a lot more going on. There's a lot. That'd be like trying to reduce the periodic table or the subatomic particles into just one thing. There's more there.
Agreed. Yeah. So let me jump to this next slide. So
I'm gonna get that bullet discourse. So is that like a funeral sermon that Joseph gave, or what is that?
Yeah, let me even. Oh, I don't know if I have.
Sorry, I to segue, but I just was curious because I never heard that one yet.
I had to shut my my Chrome, but I have a link that I can send you with all of the versions of the King Follett Discourse, like everybody who recorded it, and so you can see them all side by side to get the
sweet.
The best understanding what
we can cover that at a later time. Thank you.
Yeah. So here's an argument that I want to make that I feel like is logically sound, starting from base principles, that reality is self-caused, and I think it has to be. So here's the logic. Stop me if any of these don't make sense. I can go by them quickly if they do make sense. Everything that is perceivable can be perceived because it is differentially definable, meaning like I can see black in contrast to white, right? If there's some sort of differentiating definable feature, I can perceive it as something. Otherwise, if it were not differentially definable, it could not be perceived or detected. Anything differentially definable must have an explanation for why it is configured one way versus another, which is a cause or ultimate origin. Reality itself is a collection of everything perceivable or theoretically perceivable, detectable. Therefore, reality has an explanation, cause, or ultimate origin. There cannot be an external cause to reality as anything external that could affect reality would be real and part of reality by definition. So therefore, if it can affect reality, it's part of reality. Reality is closed, and it contains all that is real, and therefore must be internally explainable to itself. And then, therefore, because it must have a cause and it must be internally explainable, reality must be its own cause.
Which is interesting also because of the like talking about femininity, like wisdom, like Chokmah or whatever, the Sophia, the idea that it's its own cause. This is also echoed in biblical scripture.
Okay. I don't know that reference off the top of my head, but yeah.
I'll pull it later.
Stephen, can you go back a sec? I was gone for a second, so I want to reread that
Oh,
last slide.
Sure.
Sorry.
Yeah.
That seems like an important slide to make sure I got.
Yeah, you're right. It is. It's an important piece of logic because it's digging down into what I'm going to say is the uncaused cause. My argument for what that is. Is it sharing again?
No.
Let me stop sharing. Let me try again.
Hold on, we'll get there.
Entire screen.
Maybe. Yeah.
There we go.
Okay. Okay. Let me. Maybe I'll just reread this out loud and maybe add thoughts as I go.
Sure.
Reality is self-caused. Everything that is perceivable can be perceived because it is differentially definable. Otherwise, if it were not differentially definable, it cannot be perceived or detected.
So I gave the example of black versus white, right? It's different, so you can perceive it, right?
So this is a kind of a consciousness argument, perceivability, and that seems acceptable so far. Anything differentially definable must have an explanation. Yeah, that seems legit. For why it's configured one way or another, which is a cause or ultimate origin. Ooh, spicy. Reality is a collection of everything perceivable or theoretically perceivable, detectable. I think that's a little bit narrow of a definition for reality, but maybe it's good enough for this conversation. I don't know. Therefore, reality has an explanation, cause, or ultimate origin. I agree with that conclusion, at least. So, yeah. There cannot be an external cause to reality, as anything external that could affect reality would be real and be part of reality by definition. Okay, the circularity of the concept of reality. What do I feel about that? There cannot be an external cause to reality. Good enough for now. Therefore, reality is closed as it contains all that is real and therefore must be internally.
Why can't there be an external cause? And what do you mean by external cause?
Yeah. So a lot of religious thinkers, for example, will think that God is external to the universe, and they'll say God is the uncaused cause, right? But God also has the attributes of love, righteousness, goodness. So God is both a definable being in some sense. He has specific attributes.
Real nature, yeah.
A real nature that is supposedly eternal and doesn't beg an explanation. But atheists will not be satisfied by that, because how could God be something and not have an explanation? So this is really pointing out, and it could come from an atheist materialist argument too, is that there could be something outside of our reality that causes the Big Bang to rise out of nothing. I've never heard an attempt at a real explanation with that. But
let's read. Can I read Proverbs 8?
Yeah.
Okay, so the Lord brought me forth at. First off, Proverbs is about Sophia, right? Because Proverbs is about wisdom. You should all know that Proverbs is about wisdom, but wisdom isn't like a word.
That's my lover. That's my lover you're talking about.
Yeah, I know. Get my wife's name out of your mouth. I know. But wisdom isn't just a idea. It's a chick, and it's not just a chick. It's also an idea. And I don't mean the Heavenly Mother is just a chick, but bruh, I'm from California. The Lord brought me forth. Wait, no, I'm gonna pull up my whale free will here, because we're talking about the Matrix, and the Matrix is Sophia, because the Matrix is the womb, and the reality is the Matrix, right? So simulation theory, as long as it's Mormon, is chill. The Lord brought me forth as the first of his works. This is Proverbs 8:1. before his deeds of the old. Okay, so in other words, in what you just said, this formless thing, I was formed long ago, long ages ago, at the very beginning, when the world came to be, when there were no water depths, I was given birth, when there were no springs overflowing with water, before the mountains were settled in place, before the hills, I was given birth. So again, like before the creation myth is kind of the point. The first thing that's created is the reality, is the matrix, is wisdom, and you live inside of wisdom. I was there when before any of the dust of the earth. I was there when he set the heavens in place, when he marked out the horizons on the face of the deep, when he established the clouds above and fixed securely the fountains of the deep, when he gave the sea its boundaries, so when the waters would not overstep his command, and when he marked out the foundations of the earth. I was constantly at his side. I was filled with delight day after day, rejoicing always in his presence, rejoicing in the whole world, and delighting in mankind. And I think I missed the line about before the light even, but there's a part there like in the darkness. So this is before in the Big Bang, before anything is created, before the form of anything. The first thing that is created is wisdom, right? And she is not just by his side, but the whole world is actually created essentially in her, right? And then God's going through into her, into that world and existing through avatars, which we then see in like Enoch and everything else. I find that related because this idea that reality is in a relationship, like again, the creator is in a relationship with the created, isn't enough. It's also that, like you said, energy consciousness is shaping itself into every part, right? Because it's the breath going into all of the stardust, all of the dust.
Yep. So in my language, if we recall this Sophia or wisdom, consciousness, or in Mormon parlance, intelligence with capital I, that I think would align with the view that I'm also putting forward.
Yeah.
I have a lot of thoughts on that, but it's way too much of a tangent, so just stop me
Okay. I'll try presenting again. Let's see. Sorry, I haven't figured out the fast way to do that, but
it's chill.
So the basic idea is whether you want to call it something external to reality that causes the Big Bang, or if you wanted to call this thing God, if it can affect reality, then it's perceivable, right? There's a cause and effect. There's a theoretical perceivability to the thing that causes. We see the effect, so we detect the cause. Therefore, it's part of reality. If it were separate than reality, how could it interact with reality? Like there's no interaction if it's not also real.
Right. But if you were to accept the Big Bang, like
yes.
a lot, like you could say, okay, this universe is like it's the result of the Big Bang, and so we would think this universe is reality. But then hypothetically, something causes the Big Bang.
Yes.
So then there's like a meta reality, like outside the scope of this universe, there's another layer.
Yes.
And that layer of reality gives birth to this layer of reality.
Yes.
And then you just keep pushing the problem back. Well, that layer of reality needed something to give birth to it.
Yes.
And so are you accepting like an infinite regress in this explanation?
That's going to be the next slide, where I will reject an infinite regress as a possibility, because that's also not logically possible. But it's true. Like the Big Bang must have been given birth, right, by something, and that must have been caused by something. But I will argue. Well, I can just it's really the next slide. Well, it's not this. So this is just saying reality is everything in the center. It must be. This is the source of freedom. I mean, this is really actually the crux of my argument for free will, is that reality must be self-configuring. It has no external constraints by its own necessary definition. So there's total external freedom to reality. Reality is going to be self-created, self-choosing, self-selected. Those words are loaded with intentionality, and I'll get to the point why I think that is. So here it is. The cause of reality cannot be an infinite regress because open infinities are logically impossible, right? I guess that's It's already been argued many times in philosophy before, and most everybody rejects the possibility of an infinite regress because you can't actually ever get to the place if you're going infinity backwards. It creates a paradox. So if that's true, because that was the only other option, really, is it either there's an infinite regress. Oh,
sorry, I was on mute. I was trying to interject real quick. I just want to add that me personally, I do not reject the concept of an infinite regress. But
interesting.
Continue.
Okay. Yes, as I understand it, and to me, open infinities are logically impossible, which I don't reject infinities, but I think those infinities have to be closed. And I guess I can explain that a little bit further down the line. So even if you have that open as a possibility, the other possibility, right, is everything with order or form must have a causal explanation. If it's not an infinite regress, it must have an ultimate origin. Or in other words, an ultimate origin must be an uncaused cause.
Right. The prime mover type of a thing.
Yes. Now, this is where I think some theologians get it wrong and always beg the question, what created God? Because I don't think that is the origin point. To not be caused, the origin cannot therefore have differentiated order, form, or definition. Because that was a piece of line of logic previous in the presentation, that if something is differential, then it begs an explanation why it's in that form rather than something else. So an atheist could ask a Catholic who thinks that God is the uncaused cause, well, if God is all loving, how did he obtain these attributes? Why are those his attributes rather than something else? It begs an explanation. It's not satisfying. So therefore, the first uncaused cause or origin must therefore be non-differentiated and formless. So this is where, this is going to start entering into the furthest bounds of my thinking, but I'll lay out what I have, which is this non-differentiated source can also be called boundaryless potential. I have another reason for this, which we could go into if we are going to have more time, but I'm just going to leave it there for now and see where the conversation goes.
I'm definitely interested in potential, but yeah, we'll let you keep going.
So let me just quickly say this. There's a question in physics often, which is why is there something rather than nothing? Like one of those ultimate questions is why we have a reality at all, as opposed to nothing. But I think this is a flawed question from the outset, because the concept of nothing itself is relative to a knowledge of something else existing. And I would say something is also the other side of the coin of the theoretic possibility, at least, of nothing that's in opposition to something. So this is something that I thought of a lot earlier in my life and have begun to piece it together with this more full theory. Something or nothing, I don't think, can be a proper starting point to reality. There must be something more primordial, more foundational than either that gives rise to both something and nothing. And you could think of, if we took away all the boundaries that differentially defined everything in existence right now, what would we be left with? I think the most obvious that we're left with is potential, right? There's a potential energy, or eventually I'll talk about quantum mechanics, but it's the same idea. There's a wave function of potential that can collapse into an actuality, at least under one interpretation. This might be an actual potential that is not actualized into a single reality until the moment of interaction, when the wave function collapses. So you can imagine a scenario where you have an infinite boundaryless potential. There's complete non-differentiation, complete formlessness. And ancient religions, what I'd say, tying this to religion, have intuited this and have called it the primordial chaos from which everything emerges.
Nice.
It's
So
hard
like,
to imagine having any potential without boundaries, though, right? Because isn't part of it to like reach and surpass boundaries? Like, otherwise, you're just in like a white void, or not even black or white, just in
Yeah.
I thought if anyone was going to accept boundaryless potential, I thought it would be you, Andreas. You would.
I'm a contrarian. I'm not allowed to just.
Oh, okay. Because that kind of goes into your thing of like God has the free will to just like do everything. So I'm like no boundaries, like everything.
Yeah, but
is happening.
then we wouldn't. Then why would we exist? So it's not only is that the truth.
That's many
we're
world interpretations.
We
everything is existing.
But we're the boundaries so that everything can exist, right? So otherwise, it would just be God sitting there alone in this brown like noise, you know? Because it'd be all the color, it would be one color, it'd be horrible. But if you break it all up into a mosaic, then you have with those, you have limitless potential. The more boundaries you create, like the smaller the pieces are, the more phenomenological diversity of mixing things together.
So like I think that pointing to like potential seems like a pretty intuitive, like intelligent direction to think in terms of, you know, fundamental causes. I think that's kind of a pretty interesting place to go. Okay. But it seems like potential is a type of thing in and of itself. And so to me, it kind of points to more of an infinite regress. It's like, okay, we've got the potential for this universe, but where did that potential come from? We've got like a meta potential that affords the subsequent potential. And it's like, where did the meta potential come from? Well, we need like a meta potential to afford the meta. Yeah, I mean, so it's like, where does potential come from is the next question.
Yeah, and I think the reason that can be an uncaused cause and begs no further explanation, because it is completely formless and without definition. It contains all possibility. All potential would be all possibility towards anything that can exist, but it would include everything that also would be completely paradoxical and could not exist as well. Because there's no differentiation. It has no. It's basically undefined. This is the undefinable point. It's just pure potential. No. There's nothing that can be described other than that it exists in a non-differentiated state. And I think,
So let's imagine we've got boundaryless potential, right? Yes. So I'm imagining, tell me if I'm on the right train track or whatever. I'm imagining we're at like this point of pure emptiness, and like laid before us are like all these dice for the physical constants of the universe. What is gravity going to be? What is the strong force going to be? What is the weak force going to be? What is electromagnetic force? Like, what is space-time going to look like? So we've got all of these potential values open to infinite values, right? Gravity could be anything, right? But then somehow those values need to collapse, right? They need to collapse into actuality, where we now have, the dice needs to land on something.
Yes.
And so I guess there's a problem here, which is, what is the causal mechanism for filtering potential into actuality?
Yes, exactly.
That makes sense?
Yes, no, that's the exact right question. That's basically goes into my next slide, I think.
Okay, nice.
Laws of I just threw in this picture right here. This will eventually get into an explanation.
Pictures help. People love pictures.
Yeah. So this is the clouds were to represent in my mind, or the waters, the primordial chaos. And this is, a cyclical means by which reality is generated out of the non-differentiated potential. So
pretty sweet meme, bro. I like it.
Thanks. So just like you're saying, Seth, laws in nature, like all these infinite possibilities with all the constants, etc., are included in all this, including what I would say are laws of morality, but the laws of everything. So, primordial chaos to actualized reality. How can boundaryless potential collapse into a self-sustained actuality? And here is the problem. If we have infinite boundaryless potential, you can imagine that what that also means, because there's no boundary, it simultaneously means that there's, you could say, holographically the potential for all boundaries, right? Like if I have a positive 1 boundary, it's going to create a negative 1 on the other side. If I have, so basically there's, with any potential boundary, there is the opposite of it, that this exists only in a potential state. So there's an infinite, basically, number of holographic possibilities that exist in boundaryless potential. And it's a static state. It's not in motion. It's just all of these simultaneously exist by the nature of being boundaryless and undefined. Now, the problem is it can't simply actualize randomly. And the reason it can't actualize randomly is because this is an infinite potential. And if there were some holographic boundary that had the laws of 2 + 2 = 4, somewhere along the infinite chain of holographic possibility, there is also going to be some sort of paradox that enters into the system that 2 + 2 = 10. Just a random math example, but any a law of gravity that doesn't work with the strong force constant.
You should use teleology. 1 × 1 = 2. That's the new.
1 × 1 = 2, right?
Yeah, teleology.
But yeah, same idea. Is that you could have, if you're moving this out to infinity, and we're talking about randomly actualizing, there's going to be a point in that infinity where it's not self-sustained and cannot ultimately, it would destroy the reality from actually actualizing, or would destroy what began to, if you can call it began. It's not, there's really no time and space at this point. So in order for it to collapse into an actualized reality, this comes to the second bullet point, there must be a recursive process by which all boundaries can simultaneously be analyzed and selected in order to collapse into a self-consistent reality. So because I think nothing and something cannot be a starting point, this boundaryless potential is our only option, because we live in a reality, we know something must be an uncaused cause, unless, I guess, Seth, you're still going down the line of you might accept an infinite regress. But rejecting that, so let's just take the premise of rejecting an infinite regress. The only place that we have that can be a starting point is this undefined boundaryless potential. And the only way that can, in turn, become an actualized reality that we see around us is by recursive analyzation that would be able to see all boundaries, the infinite set of boundaries, all at once, to select that which can coexist one with another. And because this is one of an infinite potential, that it inherently exists as a possibility within the system, that is the thing that's going to actualize reality. And so what I'm suggesting is that this recursive process that is able to view all boundaries simultaneously is the thing that we call consciousness or intelligence, because consciousness has the ability to view and analyze and select. So this is definitionally a proposed theory of what consciousness is. It is the thing that would be required to recursively analyze and select that which can actualize into reality. So we'd say that consciousness, in kind of modern terminology, consciousness collapses the infinite wave function. Reality is everywhere, the choice to exist. And so starting from base principles of logic, working back into what the initial uncaused cause must be and how that could actualize, we have theorized both consciousness, and we have also come to a theorization or a prediction rather for what we already see in quantum mechanics today, that there is some sort of wave function, or there is some sort of potential that exists that seems, with at least under one interpretation, one valid interpretation, a lot of the pioneers of quantum mechanics thought that ultimately it was consciousness that was responsible for collapsing the wave function. And if you see consciousness as fundamental to reality, really it's any interaction with other parts of reality itself. It's consciousness interacting with consciousness that collapses the wave function into reality. So on one hand, you have this formless, boundaryless potential that's static and never changes. There's nothing that ever changes about it. But on top of it rest the holographic potentials that, through consciousness, one of its possibilities, can analyze the infinite whole and instantaneously collapses into the infinite reality and everything that exists. So if this is outside of time and space, and instantaneously there's all that is. Okay, so it might take a little while to follow that line of thinking, but I want to just jump into this.
Not at all, actually. You know that Billy Preston song is about this. Nothing from nothing leaves nothing. You got to have something if you want to be with me, you know.
Yeah. So what I would call this process of the consciousness collapsing it instantaneously into one actualized universe, another way of thinking about it, because paradox would cause the universe to cease to exist. What this really is a process of, and I say process, it's instantaneous from the vantage point of the boundaryless potential. But to actualize reality, there must be a separating of the light from the darkness, or in other words, truth, which is the light, from paradox, which is the darkness that must go to death. Now, within space-time, I might just have to just say this.
These are some great AI pictures. I like these a lot.
Yeah, that was really helpful because I couldn't find Google images that were helping me out. So
yeah, Google's dead. It's all about AI. It's crazy.
So separating the light from the darkness, and what I'm surmising then is that the space-time is actually just an experiential phenomena of consciousness. That literally this is what we are doing right now, is that we are going through, we are experiencing, even though time is instantaneous and happens all at once, from an experiential standpoint, just like consciousness sees the color green, but the color green isn't, in some sort of material universe. Rather, it's the joint interaction between them that gives us this perception. It's the experience of green. That's what I'm suggesting is also the case with space-time itself. That it's a experiential phenomena of consciousness, right, that through the laws of evolution as well. This is really kind of a meta evolution of the universe, that Darwinian evolution with, I would say, intelligence added to the consciousness added to the mix.
Time is obviously emergent. It's like that's what it does.
Yes, and so time and space is the agent, experiential phenomenon of this process of separating the dark from the light. That's what we're doing with our choices. So my theory, this ultimate theory boils down to this: reality is a mind exploring and actualizing itself. We are the universe, both the creators and the created, the selectors and the selected. So space would be knowledge, and this is something that Joseph Smith even got right in the DNC. A lot of times people will quote the DNC wrong, saying truth is things as they are, as they were, as they will to come, but it doesn't say that. It says truth is knowledge of things as they were, as they are, and as they are to come. Truth is knowledge. So in this idea, space itself is also knowledge. Then time is the processing of that knowledge, or it's thinking. So space-time would be cognition, or the experiential phenomenon of conscious processing itself. Again, same as color. And this mind, this mind of the universe, is composed of an infinite number. This is now hearkening back to Joseph Smith. An infinite number of co-equal, co-eternal agents. Co-equal with God himself. God never did have the power to create the spirit of man. All of us are in this completely jointly. And so I really, really like this picture because I think it's representative of the whole nature of this theory, which is that, boundaryless potential actualizes in this self-caused, self-generated, self-existent way, which is, if we were to, so I've been speaking so long, I'm going to stop, but if we're going to go into the conversation of how this ties into the formless Mormon theology, this really ties into an eternal round, where there's no God that's at the beginning, there's no God that's at the end. All of us, like the scripture that even Jesus quoted from Psalms, ye are gods. We are the universe. We are co-equal, co-eternal beings that are different, just like we're in different places in space-time, and no point is the center if you imagine an infinite space-time. So also there is no God that's before, there is no God that's after. This is one eternal process that's self-generated, self-creating, and all of us are part of this. In this space-time, in the experience of consciousness, it is infinite, and has been forever, will be forever, but the origin is outside of time and space. Okay, that's it.
Based. I like it. I like the illustration of the universe holding the pen it's created to draw itself. I think that's a pretty solid metaphor. I like that a lot.
Yeah, and that's if you haven't seen it before, it's a really famous Escher painting. Yeah,
Escher's based. I like the idea also of maybe there's something to that. Like the paper's made of something, the carbon and the ink are made of something, and so again, it's that idea of like these things are being tossed up, and there's something that's happening and it's moving, but like the whole thing is made up of it. So it's always aware of it. It's there from the beginning. It's there before the beginning. It's there after the end. So beginnings and endings are happening inside of it, right? And there's there's erasure.
Yeah. And then I should probably address this to Seth, just to ultimately tie this back into the free will conversation, which is the ultimate.
Let's solo
intent.
him and get his facial reactions.
Let's hear it.
Which is to say, so, whether or not you accept all the logical premises of this being a logical necessity of the universe, at least this is a theory that if the universe really is not externally constrained, that the universe itself, and we are an infinite number of agent minds that compose this universe, are not externally constrained, then that is the freedom. We all have all self-selected collectively everything that is, and continue in that and every point is the center. So every choice is part of that creative act that comes from this consciousness that has the ability to select its own nature and select what actualizes. And that, to me, is the source of ultimate free will.
Wow, that was quite the little lecture there.
Spirit children are becoming atoms, Seth. Deal with it.
I think we need to give a round of applause to Stephen for such an epic lecture.
Dude,
this is a big metaphysical adventure through time and space. That was great. That was way deeper than the average person's perspective of free will. So congrats for that.
Thank you.
I
appreciate that.
That's why I wanted to invite you on, because it's great to have someone who's actually thought about these things.
Yeah.
So there's a lot to say here.
Yeah.
I don't even I know where to begin, but I don't know where to begin. I have to exercise my robotic will to you know, I have to access my computational algorithm to say, okay, which thread is most relevant right now.
You have to put weights on all of them, yeah.
Exactly. So like, okay, so I told you I was gonna like start from an atheist perspective. And so like the biggest atheist angle is, where's the proof? Where's the evidence, bro? Come on, dude. Why should I believe that? Like, I can see like everything is material, man. Where's the evidence of all this metaphysical stuff, right?
Yeah.
So
I love how you did that voice for that character. Thank you.
No, I like it.
like,
yeah.
I don't really like
The
that
materialist bro is real. I never knew, but
yeah. I don't really like that type of atheism, so but I have to address that first. It's like there's a valid criticism there, which is why should we believe any of this? You know what I mean?
Yeah, and my first gut response is that you know, materialism suffers from the same issue, which is that it's except that I feel like I have started with a reality and just on base principles induced that it must have a causal origin if we're going to reject, again, the premise that you didn't, which is an infinite regress. But if that is accepted, then this is logically induced that it must come from boundaryless potential. And the only way that that could actualize back out to reality is some sort of recursive process that could analyze the whole. And so this is an inductive reasoning for why reality exists. And in addition to that, we are aware of our own consciousness. And really, you know, as many philosophers have put before, that's the only thing that we are really sure of and aware of, that our own consciousness is at least aware, and therefore I am, right? So, or something is, at the very least. And we have no evidence and no reason to start with the base assumption that a material world exists outside of consciousness, because it's the only thing that we have access to. And not only that, I've never seen a materialist perspective that has a theory for why there is an ultimate origin. And to be fair, I haven't seen that from most theological perspectives either. But I am presenting to you now what I think is an inductive theory for the generation of everything that is. And until a materialist could give me an equally plausible, logical reason for the origin of all that is from a material perspective, well, then I know I'm conscious. This theory, through inductive logic, comes out with theorizing consciousness as the center and gives it an explanation for reality. Well, then, you know, that's the side that I'm going to weigh in on, because that's most convincing.
Great response. Love it. So, so like, okay, so like, where would it? If we're talking about a different explanation, or like maybe what I would consider a better explanation, I lean towards necessity, right? So first, like this idea of consciousness collapsing reality into existence, to me, there's problems with that. So I would not favor that explanation because of the problems that I will get to. And so I would think that something more like, so necessity is, you know, kind of like logical necessity is like, if this, then that. It's kind of like the idea of determinism. Like there's a chain reaction. It's like, okay, we've got, and so I embrace the infinite regress. So it's like, well, there's cause A, and then there's cause B, and then there's cause C. And we just walk down the chain, and like the Big Bang is just the next necessary step in the chain of stuff that happened before the Big Bang. And I think that there are good reasons to buy into like the objective material world, right? I think you said because you said something to the effect of you're skeptical of the material world because you only have epistemic access to consciousness and can't access the material stuff. So why should we give primacy to the external material stuff?
Yes.
I would rewind that and say, well, it's true that fundamentally we have epistemic access through our consciousness, but that consciousness is a tool that we can build epistemics upon, right? So we're not just limited to consciousness, because what happens is we use our epistemic access to consciousness and we start to observe patterns, and those patterns are objective in the sense that they are independent of us, and they're discoverable through multiple angles of perception.
But that only gets you to the point. I mean, you can use epistemology up until you can't, and then you need teleology. And so once you start seeing what things are doing with your epistemological view, then you can kind of find patterns, right? And you can see goal-oriented patterns. And if you see patterns, then you can say, okay, well, these things in nature, because of what was the word you used, necessity, have repeated. And if they've repeated, they probably go back, right? This is the same logic we have to the idea that there is a Big Bang. We're saying because we're watching stars expand, it's logical that at one point, teleologically, they were at one point together. So, I mean, everything we're doing is still epistemological.
Yeah. So I guess the point of what I was trying to get at there is that because epistemic objectivity exists, then that means material is ontologically prior to consciousness. Okay. And maybe I need to unpack that for a second.
Yeah, please.
So epistemic objectivity is the fact that things are true independent of our perspective, right? Our perspective is consciousness, right? They're like flat Earth versus round Earth. There's an objective truth, irregardless of all of our perspectives.
Yeah, the universe is a hologram, right?
How many planets are orbiting around the sun? Is the sun the center, or is the Earth the center? These are all epistemically objective truths, independent of our consciousness, right? And our consciousness has to discover these truths, right? So our consciousness is not inventing these truths; it's discovering these truths, and by virtue of discovering, it means that these truths existed prior to this discovery, prior to the consciousness.
I don't know. Things do change, and like we do affect the things that change, right? And this kind of the thing we brought up earlier, the Copenhagen argument, this idea that things are in potential before they happen, and we don't completely understand what influences lead to what potentials there are. But also things change. So you could say like a planet that's revolving around the sun counter-elliptically, which is associated with another body. This is what the Planet X or Nibiru thing is. But a better example would be maybe Pluto, right? Isn't always behind or in front of Neptune. Sometimes we decide or to redefine it as a planet or say that it's just another satellite of Neptune. There's all of these examples of things where they change. It's not just because we're changing our definitions even. It's things moving, and we're finding out that there's other patterns that we aren't noticing, right? So it's true to an extent. Like for us, there's only maybe 9 planets because we're not experiencing very commonly 65,000 or 25,000 year interactions with other systems where there is another satellite that's interact. But we have evidence of that, right? So now that changes our epistemology, but that doesn't necessarily affect whether or not it's ontologically true. And if it is, that's another example. You could then say, all right, is there a base on Mars? No. Well, now there is, right? So I don't know. We can very easily change reality.
Well, what do you mean by change reality then?
Like if there isn't a base on Mars and you put a base on Mars, now there's a base on Mars, right? If you believe there was a base on Mars, does it even matter if there wasn't before you put it there? Because now everyone's got what they wanted, right? You manifest it. I mean, you manifested it with materialism still. That was part of your equation. But it started with a thought, right? It started with a belief.
Yeah, but yeah, so like there's a truth about Mars that's prior to your cognition, that's prior to your consciousness, and then you engage with your consciousness and you realize you want to put a base on Mars, and then you apply your consciousness to materials and you activate materialistic changes to the materialistic world. So all of that is consistent with materialism, and none of that is evidence for, oh, it's all idealism. You know
okay, so you're going for like when people say like they can imagine new planets into existence just because enough critical thoughts are seeing something. But isn't that also kind of mass hysteria can work that way? Like if everyone believes that there are dragons in the water, Isn't that kind of what sharks are or something? Like maybe there is something to that too. I don't know. I wouldn't push it that hard though.
One thing that I want to jump in and say though is that I see your reasoning being somewhat circular, in that you're saying that because there is an agreed upon world out there, that so you're using the word objective, and I can agree with that. But I know on Facebook we've had some of these comments too, like what is objective and what is subjective. So I agree that there is this world out there that is going to be able to be unified, agreed on by all conscious beings, but that does not show or prove that that thing could exist independent of consciousness. It could ultimately be relying on all the conscious minds, co-creating this universe. That's just as valid as an explanation. It doesn't prove that there's a priori material before consciousness. It just means that whatever the reality is, it is self-consistent, and conscious beings can agree on what are these things that we are all simultaneously observing. That's all we know.
Yeah. So yeah, I have lots of problems with that too. Probably the best direction to go here is the nature of mind. So, because that seems to be central to your argument, is that it's kind of like this collective mind is fundamental, and this collective mind is creating the material world. Yes. And there's a lot of problems with like the mechanisms. It's like, well, how are all these little intelligences agreeing? We're gonna vote on what gravity should be, and we agree that Mars should be this way.
Well, did you just say that it started out as a collective pure intelligence, and then after that is divisible? So from source into Elohim family, from Elohim family into celestial archon, from celestial archon into material form, from material form through evolution.
And that's the way we would see it in time. But in reality, what I'm saying is the universe itself, to actualize, was it was necessary for the whole of it, the entire of the infinity, to be simultaneously observed. And so I think the universe actualized instantaneously, which means that in our perception of time, that the future in many ways is just as causal as the past. Like there's no real differentiation between the future and the past. This was a collective decision on the laws of the universe that could harmoniously coexist. Otherwise, there would be no actualization, because at one point or another, then reality collapses with paradox. It had to be.
You know about Amdahl's law, right? Amdahl's law
Oh.
is a parallelization law. So theoretically, we could have every single lifetime in history pretty much happen simultaneously, but it would probably still take a lifetime to process every lifetime, because the order of operations, a lifetime might still have to happen in order. So there's some like rule to time, basically, that like maybe every your grandparents are happening right now, your grandchildren are happening right now, but it's all happening in real time.
That's weird. Okay. So okay, I think maybe it would be useful to get clear on like where are these intelligences that are defining the attributes of Mars? Where are the intelligences that are defining the attributes of the sun? Is it like humans in 2024? Is it Jesus in 30 BC or 30 AD?
Mm-hmm.
Like who's deciding these attributes?
Yeah. And this comes to the more close to LDS theology. So I would say it's the formed gods, or in other words, in this portion of our actualized reality, the time and space that we're seeing, there are beings that have, in their own processes, have advanced such that they understand at least all things from an end to a beginning, at the very least. So in this iteration of the universe, this universe that started with a Big Bang, then presumably is going to have an end, that there is a being that was capable of seeing all of the potential of this creation, with all the experience that he attained, before on all his lifetimes, if you want to put it that way, eternal lives, that he had sufficient knowledge such that he could tap into the infinite collective consciousness, if you want to put it that way, to make that decision. But if we were to step outside of time from the realm of boundaryless potential, this is really in harmony with all other gods across all other times that would be jointly making these decisions. And so it really is, and we would be part of that. We're at a different time and place. So everybody, when they have advanced to that point, would be collectively, future, past, and present, infinitely deciding this is the way that it should be. Hence the picture of the hands going like this, you know, or putting camera, right? Because it's necessary that it's self-generated, self-created.
Did you ever read Neil Gaiman's Sandman? You know, that old comic book? You got to read comic books. You can't fight vampires and werewolves if you don't have comic books. But in the Sandman, there's a story about all of these cats. It's like a world where the cats rule things. Basically, there's 7 endless, which is all, you know, Gnostic. But Dream meets the cats, and the cats are ruling over these tiny little people, right? And then the people get together and start a dream. One guy comes up with this dream, and they say, we're all going to dream this dream. A dream where cats are small and where humans are big, right? And then eventually they wake up into that dream collectively, and that's the world we live in, where cats are house cats and domesticated. On one hand, it's a comic book and it's a metaphor, but on the other hand, there were giant cats. And in a sense, I think we do that. We do affect things through thought. And it's more that through the thought, we make the physical choices, your material excuse for how things happen. But those are happening after these thoughts, right? Evolutionarily, it's really consciousness, which is driving all of these choices on, you know, marriage and reproduction and survival and education and priority. So I feel,
So, okay. So back to trying to figure out who and when is this decision-making going on. So like in Mormon theology, you've got like all these intelligences, and theoretic, like you've got a God intelligence, you've got human intelligences, for like every human has an intelligence. You've got animal intelligences, and then there's multiple points in time. And so like at what point in time, because like you seem to grant determinism. So like maybe all of these intelligences are voting on the attributes of the universe at the time of the Big Bang, and then they stop voting, they're done voting, and then they just let the universe roll out into, like, Mars has the properties of Mars because of what was decided at the Big Bang. Is that where you're going with this?
Well, it's hard to put in words, because what I'm saying is the decision is in large part made out of space-time. So when the decision is made, all things have happened. So it's not really like everything playing out, right? It's like there's all the potential possibilities. This reminds me of, oh gosh, what's it called? Middle knowledge, which is a Christian theology of how God intervenes in free will, but is still creative, right? He can see all the possibilities that would happen according to all the lesser intelligence choices. But with all of that and his will combined, he will manifest the choice that allows his plans to proceed as intended. Now, that's just looking at one God and lesser intelligences. But what I'm saying is that we are all the creators and the created. And so if you really were to step it back, what I'm saying is that the choice is ultimately made while there will be one agential being, a God of a universe, that's voicing that decision. Really, it's a collective decision of every single infinite being, past and present, at all the points that they too are at a state of godhood. Mm-hmm. So it's everyone everywhere is the
what's
answer.
The in the book of Abraham, right? It's like, and they stood before him. Hold on, let me find this. And they stood before him. That was, and then there stood one among them that was like unto God, and he said unto them, who are with him, we will go down, for there is a space there, and we will take of these materials, and we will make an earth wherein they may dwell, right? So it's like, material afterthought. We think about, like, hey, I have an idea, and then let's do the thing.
So are you, Stephen, are you imagining this as this vote is taking place outside of space-time? And
it's tapping into all the collective thought that ultimately exists outside of space-time, yes.
So like if an intelligence were to become exalted, when you step outside of space-time, they're already exalted.
Yes.
Because being exalted is transcending space-time and becoming, that's godliness, right? And so
exalted is both being formed and still in some sense existing in space-time, but also having full access to the spaceless, timeless realm in which, the formless realm in which all things simultaneously exist. But there will still, each of us as individuals, we will never go away from space-time, even though we might be able to access that spaceless, timeless collection of a unified intelligence. We will still always be permanently and infinitely
I feel like
our individual selves.
The fact that we have to exist, right, and the idea of being material is part of this process that's supposed to evolutionarily lead to a higher form celestially, kind of to me says that it's, infinity and eternity, but not necessarily boundless potential the way that we're describing it. Like, it's pure potential to make all things, but only through taking away that potential and being material. So you have to go through some sort of process which is material to evolve or to become refined or in some way. Otherwise, you can't be, exalted. Otherwise, you're just a spirit until you're formed. And so the material form seems like an important step.
Yeah.
So what I was trying to get at is once you become exalted, you become eternal in nature. And by becoming
I think you're already eternal. Oh, but your nature becomes eternal with you.
Right. You become an eternal being.
You're already an eternal being, though, right?
You become...
See? You become a god. You can say it. You become a god.
God, like theoretically, God has eternally been a god, right? And in order to be eternally,
I think we
underuse
the word.
You have to transcend space-time for that to even work.
But we're using the word God lightly. So, like, the idea is that the Heavenly Father is not a god. That's like a lower. That's like gods are the dogs that sit on the porch of the thing that we're talking about. That's the thing.
Well, I think both simultaneously exist, right? There is no collective conscious, if you want to call it the ground of all being, that formless God that doesn't exist independently of all the infinite formed beings. Like they are simultaneously co-eternal. They don't exist without each other, and they are each other. They're just one aspect of the nature of the other.
So is it fair to describe this determining force as a collective deity, where it's all of these exalted intelligences are working together to define the attributes of Mars, for example?
Yeah, which we are a part of that. Yes.
Okay. Okay, so now, so that kind of pushes us to the nature of God, which God is supposedly has a mind, because all of this reduces to mind and consciousness.
Yes.
So the problem with mind, the problem with will, right? When you're making a decision, you have to have a value system, and that the value system is what informs the decision-making process, right? And so the way I view will and decision-making is as an algorithm. Right? And it's a pretty simple algorithm. You can make it more complex, but it's basically, you have to consider your options, right? And that you can bring this back to your boundless potential, right? So something is observing all the options, yes, right? But in order to decide upon the options, you have to have a value system. Yes. And so you take each option and you algorithmically measure it against the value system. Does this option satisfy my goals? No. Next option. Does this option satisfy my values? Mm-hmm. Yeah. No. And you iterate, and iteration is software, robotic, deterministic algorithms. You're iterating through your options. You say, well, this one, it satisfies my values to the degree of 50%, and this one satisfies me to the degree of 70%. And well, this one's 80%, and nothing is better than 80%. Okay, we're going with that option. All of that is completely deterministic. All of that is completely robotic. And that is what God has to do in order to make a selection. And so my opinion is that God must follow these same algorithmic processes, which makes him robotic, which makes God lack free will, which undermines the entire concept of free will existing.
Yeah, and I would agree if the origin of God was created, he was externally created. But what I'm saying is those decisions ultimately have an origin in something else that's happening. Now we're looking at that in time, but what I'm suggesting is that outside of time, there's a dual simultaneous choice that's happening, a recursive choice, which is the formulation of the will and what the will selects simultaneously. So there is no pre-existing will before this recursive process, because the will is being selected in addition to all the choices that the will makes simultaneously. And that's what allows freedom. It's not a robotic process. It's a self-generated process where you get to select your will and what your will selects.
Yeah, but for me, the word select carries with it the algorithm of selection. And so when you say the will is getting selected, what I hear is there's a meta algorithm that selects the algorithm that, so we have
there is a constraint. Yeah, there is one constraint, and that constraint is that for reality to exist, it must be self-consistent. That's the constraint that ultimately determines, if you want to say that ultimately allows the will to be selected. It's selecting for that which chooses to exist. Although within time, we do have, demons, sons of perdition, that are choosing against existence. But the ultimate, if all collective intelligences didn't ultimately decide to choose to exist, we wouldn't be in a universe. We would be in boundless potential that never went anywhere.
Yeah, but what I'm arguing is that in order for them to choose to exist, they must have a pre-organized algorithm that lets them choose to exist. And that has to have an origin. And that's the problem that makes them robotic, is where, like, they're being forced to follow the algorithm that they were given.
I mean, if you're born, though, with lack of memory, like tabula rasa you're doing a lot to make it possible for you to have, free will, right? You're trying to do as much as you can to be like, all right, I want this kid to start out being able to drive, but I don't want him to be just like me. So they're giving you have an amazing amount of instinct, but you don't know why, right?
Sure.
Doesn't that help with your free will thing? Then all of a sudden you're able to.
I guess I'm not connecting the dots here.
I mean, because you don't know that you made this choice, and you don't really understand all of the ramifications around you. Most of your interpretation of those ramifications are going to be societally taught to you, not given to you from before you were born, right? So it's not, I mean, you do have a lot more free will because of that. Even if it's influenced by people, it's not influenced by the system itself at that point.
I mean,
because you can interpret whatever, like you could interpret your back pain or like a wrist surgery or going bald or being, transgender. Like you can interpret that however you wanted to interpret that. So you do have more freedom than you think you do.
Well, it depends on what you mean by freedom. Like I said, I've been consistent this whole time that when I say free will, I'm talking about not being a slave to an algorithm, right?
Yes.
In order to have free will, you have to be able to escape the algorithm. And so if your algorithm says, I must follow my culture, that's not free will.
Yeah, but you're not born. No one's born with that algorithm that tells you have to. instilled in you by nurture, right? There's no like specific race of people that say I genetically, instinctually must follow no, that's always something learned, right?
Well, it's because causation, like agential causation, is complex. You've got 80 billion neurons in your brain doing tons of things. So neuroscience is one of the most important topics in the free will debate and addressing idealism, because neuroscience provides the materialistic foundation for how materials are creating the algorithm, and the algorithms are creating the consciousness, and the algorithms are creating the decisions. And so instead of consciousness being fundamental, it's like, whoa. The materials are fundamental. Then you have neuroscience. Then you have decisions, and then you have,
Yeah, but that's just a presupposition that the material is at the base.
It's the only thing that makes sense when you understand the science, right? So
no, I don't think so, because all you're doing is observing causality, but you haven't identified the beginning of the chain. It's presumptive to assume that the material is at the beginning of the chain, and I would argue, no, it doesn't. It's not only not the thing that. Not only does it. Sorry, I'm mixing my words, but it's not an explanation of. It's not the explanation that makes sense, because it doesn't even have an explanation at the origin point.
Right.
If you go back far enough, the materialist story ends. It ends with a miracle, which is that material suddenly came into existence without explanation. Like no explanation. At the end, it's just like material came into existence and it is material. That's the presupposition. There's no answer that I've ever seen that gives credibility to where that origin point is.
Unless it's energy, which then could be potential thought. Yeah.
So then I would go back to just sharing this quick graphic again, just because I think I said it was the crux, even though it's a really simple, dumb graphic. I want to share it just one more time.
It usually is, man. Graphics will do that.
This right here, which is that reality by logical necessity must be self-contained, because if there's anything outside of it that can affect reality at any point ever, then it is part of reality by definition. And so reality itself is not externally constrained. It cannot be. It has total external freedom. And so that we could simplify this, and we could treat and pretend reality was just a single individual. There are people that believe that this unified consciousness is just one being. So let's just pretend that is the case. If we saw this as one being, all of reality is one being, there is no starting algorithm. There is no.
There has to be, because you don't have mind without algorithms, and minds require materials. So material has to come first, because you don't get algorithms without materials.
Well, that's a presupposition that minds need materials, right? That's just a statement of faith. That's not a necessity.
We can design a mind. Minds are emergent concepts. They have building blocks. You can't just say, oh, there's a magical mind floating around. It's fundamental. There's no subcomponents. That's completely incoherent.
I totally could. Who's that Russian guy who came up with that theory? The emergent Russian guy, the brain that appears in space. Oh man.
But we haven't done that.
The Boltzmann brain hypothesis. Yes, the Boltzmann brain hypothesis.
No, the Boltzmann brain has subcomponents. It's emergent. It's not fundamental. It doesn't lack building blocks.
That's not your argument. You were arguing about algorithms. There's no necessary algorithm. Like the idea that in an energy expand, like from 0 point energy, if energy is then expanded beyond 0 point, that it is divisible into material, and that those material particles have not necessarily an algorithm until later, but that they just randomly combine until they make sacred geometrical forms. I mean,
right, but the aspect of combination is an emergent process. So idealism says mind is fundamental.
Combination is an emergent process because all things start as one. So it doesn't. It's cyclical then, right?
Emergence is the opposite of fundamentality. So
except that because I mean, emergent just means that something comes and goes. But if it comes and goes repeatedly, then it's a teleological pattern, right? So if something is combining together because things used to be together, then it's only emergent in the sense, even if things come back apart, as long as it started out as one uniform whole, then emergence is, still based on the original principle. Emergence is nothing new if it started out as a whole and it's coming back together.
You're arguing that there's nothing more than the sum of the parts. Is that what you're saying?
I don't know if that's exactly what I'm saying, but the sum of the parts are if energy is mass, then yes, right?
Like,
Okay.
I think this argument too, like the presupposition that I see you making as well, is that there is a possibility at all that some sort of consciousness can emerge from dead material. Like, people just make that assumption and they throw around the word emergent.
Yeah.
But I'm a program that works with all different types of recursion, and there's no ones and zeros that are ever going to combine in a way that suddenly consciousness just pops. Suddenly it's experiencing itself like that.
I tend to believe the same. I think that if AI becomes conscious, it's because we've given it a place for energy to go into. It's not, it's not
tapping into consciousness, right?
Tapping in, yeah, exactly.
Rather than
which means that
dead material causing consciousness.
It could be reincarnated from people or trees or who knows, but it's energy that's existed since the beginning. I believe.
So I actually agree with you, Stephen. I think that's an intelligent point. That there's a difference in kind problem, which is if you start with dead materials and then you just add a bunch of dead materials together, suddenly living consciousness appears. It's like, that doesn't make sense. There's two different categories of ontology. There's no causal linkage. Why does deadness create aliveness? That doesn't make sense. I agree. I would just reject the premise that they're dead materials. I would go with a Russellian monism, where energy is the fundamental primordial substance. Energy transforms into material. Energy also transforms into qualia. And what happens is these energetic processes create materials, and the materials create life, and life hacks in to consciousness. So the materials are generating consciousness based on the fundamental potentiality within energy, but you cannot create the consciousness without having a substrate in the first place. And the substrate is the materials.
So, seems like you said the exact opposite, though, right? You just said Steve, but you just said the opposite of what you said in a row. Because the first thing you said is that the material needs the energy, but then you're saying that the energy needs the material to exist, which is clearly not the case, because the energy is then so everything is tapping into this energy rather than producing consciousness.
Yeah, it seems like in your view, energy is not dead in the same way material might be.
Yes, basically.
So if energy is not dead, then I think we're just playing a semantics game. I'm just saying that's consciousness.
Good job. No, I agree.
What I'm saying is materials are fundamental, and organizations of materials produce complex consciousness. And
I heard you say faith without works is not dead. Yeah, I agree with that too, Seth.
Well, that's interesting, because I also agree that our species-specific conscious experience is reliant upon the organization of the materials. Like the reason we see green and dogs see blue and yellow only, or the reason that the energy, if you want to put it that way, is experiencing reality the way that it is because the materials are being formed in the way that they are. Like it's clearly conscious experience is a result of the formulation of the, I would call it the radio transmitter having an input that gives a certain experience. It ultimately is feeding down into what I think you would call energy. But to me, that's just consciousness. It's feeding down to a consciousness, and the organization of the material is necessary to feed it something, right? I think outside of this mortal world, there are other ways that you can feed the conscious energy, but that is necessary to experience what we're experiencing.
Yeah, so I don't really think there's any reason to give credence to this like radio transmitter theory of consciousness. Like we know how consciousness works in the brain. We don't know the hard problem of consciousness, but we know the causality of consciousness, right?
We know the correlates of consciousness, right?
Well, we know the causation. Like the common phrase is correlation is not causation. We actually know the causation. It's not just correlation.
Oh, that would solve the hard problem, right?
No.
The ultimate cause is knowing what consciousness is then.
No, the hard problem is the how. It's the mechanism. We know we know how to go from A to B, but we don't know what's in between A and B. The hard problem is what's in between A and B. So A and B, like we can stick a needle into a neuron. Neuron is A. We stick a needle into neuron, we add some electricity, and then suddenly conscious experience emerges. That's B. So there is a causal relationship. If I zap your neuron, I can cause consciousness to appear in your subjectivity. We know that there is a causal link between what we do to the neuron and what you experience.
You're defining things differently. Now you're saying that Lacanian expressions of memory are thoughts, and that those thoughts are consciousness, and I don't really agree. So the idea that consciousness can be channeled, tapped into, can use memory from material space, can use systems, I agree with all that. The idea that then those thoughts that are produced are new consciousness, I don't really agree with. I think that's just more of the same consciousness, bent and shaped and formed.
Are you saying that you don't believe that neurons create like micro pieces of consciousness that add up to the entirety of consciousness?
Correct. I don't. I think synapses and patterns and efficiency of flow of highways and infrastructure for consciousness are helping consciousness do its job that it's inherently always been meant to do. It's not that consciousness itself is accumulating necessarily. Maybe it's organizing, right?
So now you've just got this magical idea of consciousness. Like
that's all pure energy. Yeah.
Everything has building blocks. That's how causation, things are built together.
If you don't have a room and you don't have a need for a hippocampus, then you're this whole white room boundless potential thing you're talking about, then it doesn't really matter. But if you all of a sudden are like, you can only go so far and you can go far forward, and what is forward? Then all of a sudden you need these metrics, and your mind becomes a tool for consciousness to use. But it's not that consciousness itself is like being produced in a factory by material.
That's completely neuroscientifically wrong. Dead wrong. Consciousness is not a top-down force that's operating the brain like a puppet master. It's like, ooh, today I want to activate this neuron. Like the soul is not playing piano on the brain. You can do brain scans. There's no invisible energy coming from outer space.
There's invisible energy everywhere, and we're quantum entangled. And there's definitely EMF patterns that are leaving room. We are producing an EMF pattern right now that is probably connecting us over millions of miles, thousands.
As not relevant to the scope and scale of neuroscience.
It is, as long as you look at the condition of free will outside of the individual. If you think the individual is not wholly part of the superorganism, then sure, maybe the singular soul, but that's not even a Jewish or Christian concept, really. The idea is that we have 613 parts of the being, right? And that we're all part of each other. So that it doesn't really make sense that it should be separated. You're saying, oh, well, there's no separation. I agree with that. Like we're all connected.
This is 100% empirical, and there's zero evidence to support this outlandish hypothesis that neurons are activating.
I'll point out that I'm wearing shorts for this debate. I just want everyone to know.
Okay. Well, the thing is that you can say that that's outlandish, but I think the reality from the materials perspective, if you go down the chain of causality, it ultimately comes to an empty basis.
It comes to an empty basis 13.8 billion years ago. But
doesn't matter.
Like 1 minute ago, we know what the brain is doing. We know why you're doing what you're doing. It's not because of a soul.
Yeah, but
it's not because
if you build
magic.
Your foundation on an empty, on an empty foundation, then everything topples over if you got your premise wrong.
Okay. So
I'm going to need to bring Seth on Thursday or Friday, and Stephen, you're welcome. We're going to do with Bernie from Crypto Alchemist a real science show. I don't know when Seth's really awake, but I also want to get our friend Wesley from the Science Lab in San Francisco, and we should get a few people who've worked I have a friend through Wesley who worked on the brain scanning Berkeley system, which there are a lot of people that really know a lot more about this than I or you, I'd say, even that are working in this field, right? And they don't agree that this is just completely solved, for one thing. And they certainly are not erring on the idea that material is producing consciousness over the idea that consciousness, and rather energy, as we're saying it, is a pervasive, ubiquitous force, right? So I think we need to look at the science more before we say, oh, sure, like we're convinced that, you know, the mind is a consciousness factory.
It's so solid at this. Neuroscience is so good at this point. If you just know like the tiniest fraction of neuroscience, it just blows all of these theories out of the water. And it's too hard to do a neuroscience 101 class in like 2 hours, because it takes 30 hours to download all this information. But like I was saying, you put needles in the brain, there's causal relationships. Guess what? When you're putting a needle in the brain, that's material. When you're pumping electricity in the brain, that's material. This is a materialistic process that is producing conscious experience.
Again, that's circular. That's circular. You're assuming the needle's material, right? And you're assuming that the brain is also material, quote unquote.
There's like, no good argument.
And you're calling the emotional responses of an event consciousness, rather than the potential to have those. I don't know.
There is no good argument for saying that there's a little needle soul, and there's no such thing as a material needle. It's a little needle agent.
Again, it's the Gagul Nashamat. There's 613 parts of the soul.
This little needle agent, it has the free will, and it just so conveniently, it freely chooses to do whatever your hand tells it to do. Like, there's a chance that it would defy your hand, but no, it likes following your hand because it's free, but it deterministically follows you. Come on. A needle has free will. A needle has an intelligent spirit.
No, but it has been selected by a conscious being to be the way that it is, right? The same as the laws of the universe themselves are selected for.
And a needle is made up of the same material that everything else is made of.
The thing is, like, you want to just focus on the now rather than go 13 billion years ago, but I think that's the whole crux of the whole issue. Like, what I have presented is a theory, at least, whether you accept the logical induction that I have presented, it is a theory from ground up. This is how it is created from the very beginning, that the laws of the universe themselves. But what the material sphere doesn't provide is any reason that the best that we've been given is the anthropic principle, which has, new atheists have backed away from and said, actually, it is really weird. It does beg an explanation. We don't have a reason for the laws of physics the way that we are. We don't have a reason for the very foundation of energy or material. There's no foundation whatsoever. And I have given you that on the idealist side. So there's no comparable.
I can give you foundations all day long, but it took you an hour and a half to give a foundation.
Sure.
I don't think we have an hour and a half for me to give a materialistic foundation.
Well, we can do it next time. On Free Will 2.
We could do a materialistic foundation next time.
That is true. And I do feel a little bit bad that it feels a little like 2 against 1, because I know originally we were thinking 2-2.
This is how we do. This is how we treat Seth. We always do him dirty. Don't worry.
Yeah, I can never predict Andreas. Like, sometimes he's on my team and then sometimes he's against me. I never know what to expect.
I flip a coin right before to decide what I'm going to do.
He's like, that's why I said, if anything can convince me of true randomness, it's like there's a quantum field over here. I don't know how it's going to collapse today.
We're going to find the truth, and I don't know where exactly it is, but somewhere in the middle. Yeah. Well, let me also say, everyone, if you haven't checked out Stephen Fellows before, like, he did a video with us earlier, and we'll be doing, I think, another video probably next week or something. But I think you did, what was it, like the Jacob Isbell video, which was really interesting, which was great because there was recently a debate, and a lot of people are really interested in this subject of polygamy and everything, and everyone's like watching this video over here with like the debate. I honestly think you guys are probably going to watch the video with Steven over here, because it was a really good conversation. It wasn't exactly like an egregious debate. It was more just, we're going to like try to think about this. I think it was great. I loved it.
Yeah.
Sorry, keep going, Seth.
Yeah. So you mentioned 2 things. There's like, I can quickly address some of the things you're saying. So like, Terence McKenna, he made a commonly quoted statement that modern science is based on the principle, give us one free miracle and we'll explain the rest, right? And so it seems like you're kind of appealing to, like, okay, for Stephen, the fundamental miracle is just give me like consciousness, and these consciousnesses can produce everything. It's like,
No,
okay,
I think I've explained the origin of consciousness of itself from boundless potential, boundaryless
I've-
potential.
I completely critique the idea of consciousness as being this independent substance, free of mind, free of material, free of algorithm, free of values.
How do you
any of that.
how do you distinct energy then from consciousness, right? What's the difference there?
Energy is just like microscopic potential, and it can energy can transform into gravity, it can transform into magnetism, it can transform into light, it can transform into matter, it can transform into motion. Why not let it transform into the color red? Why not transform into the color blue? And so I just say the fundamental material is energy. I don't know why, that's just my miracle. Like, we have this potential. Like, I agree, potential is a good starting place. For some reason, we got energy. And then what happens is, like, maybe there's like these little tiny sparks of consciousness, but they're irrelevant. Like, what is a spark of red?
So wait, what is consciousness then? Because you said all those
So,
things sound like consciousness to me, but you said that was energy.
Okay. So units of sentience would be like when you see an image, right? I'm seeing a TV screen. So a TV screen is the summation of thousands of pixels, right?
Mm-hmm.
So each little pixel is a unit of color. And the combination of all these units of color is vision. And so when I am conscious of like a picture.
So when you're aware, you think awareness is consciousness.
Well, awareness is the summation of a bunch of pixels. So my awareness, I have a red pixel over here. I've got a green pixel over here. I'm aware of thousands of pixels at every second.
Yeah,
so
I would say awareness is not the same as consciousness, though. Right? A lot of people are not aware they're conscious. You know, a lot of things.
It depends on how you define it. I don't really care how you define it, but like, I have a complex consciousness, but my complex consciousness is the summation of all the tiny building blocks of small consciousness, right? So I have a bunch of small audio consciousness. It's like, oh, here's a frequency.
I thought you were the summation of all the material, all the small pieces of material.
The material is creating the units of. So in my ear,
I thought you said they were primordial conscious. I'm sorry, keep going. I'm trying to follow it though.
I'm a material being.
Where does the primordial consciousness introduce itself? When do we meet
my materials are hacking into the potential of energy to create units of consciousness for evolutionarily adaptive purposes.
Yeah, I think you're really close. It's almost there. But that's like pretty much it. It's that, but it's not that you're making consciousness.
That's completely different from idealism.
You're having awareness, and you're calling awareness consciousness, but consciousness is the preceding thing which you're becoming aware of, right? Self-awareness is using all these tools of material, but that's not the same as making new consciousness. That's just a furthered awareness. Like, you become aware of your consciousness.
Yeah, but the consciousness is fundamentally bottom up. There's zero top-down consciousness in my paradigm. It's all bottom up, which means
you're saying bottom is all of consciousness and it's going up through material. Yes.
No, I'm saying, so there's energy at the bottom, and then there's evolution of materials, and those materials are hacking into energy.
Consciousness. Energy.
They're hacking into energy to create units of consciousness, units of sentience, and they're building a picture of reality with energy. And then the materials will take advantage of that picture of reality to be a better agent. And all of that is bottom up. All of that is deterministic. All of that is algorithmic. All of that is robotic. You can build an AI, and the AI says, okay, here are the pixels of reality, and I want my trajectory, I'm going to aim towards the red pixels, and I'm going to stray away from the green pixels. That's all bottom up. None of that is like a top-down soul saying, ooh, I like red things. Let me go towards, like, where did that come?
If you're blind, you can't see the red, right? So you have to have the material of eye in order to use the consciousness that's already there in order to have emotional feelings and all of these memories about that thought. So it's not that you're creating, it's that you're growing, shaping, sculpting something, but you're not manufacturing new consciousness. Consciousness is just the thing using that system that you're talking about.
So yeah, I'm a little confused on how you're using consciousness, because I don't know if you're using top down or bottom up. because I
It's a little bit
disagree
of
with.
it's a little bit of outside and inside rather than just one or the other. But is that God, an energy, this thing that's outside of space-time, energy is conscious. That's kind of the thing a lot of atheists don't like,
I
is
don't.
that idea that
So
there's kind of a
if
consciousness there,
this
and
is
it's
an important point,
using material.
I do not believe energy is a complex consciousness. And that's why I disagree with idealism. Idealism thinks there's all these complex consciousnesses at the bottom that are like deciding and voting. And well, I
It's
like
more
this.
no, it's more like
Like
a consciousness complex, because it's the idea that it is all of consciousness.
Energy has the potential for the most dumb version of consciousness possible.
Without seeing, it can't see.
One, like energy, it's like it transforms into 1 pixel of redness. It's like, that's completely dumb. You can't do anything with that unless you link it into an algorithm.
It
right?
can't even just be red. It's like it can't do. So the idea of material is that if you can't, let's say you are conscious, but you're a single-celled sea amoeba, and you can't do anything but sense the feces of other life at the bottom of the sea in order to survive. I mean, evolutionarily, it makes sense to give consciousness more sensorial information and more memory, so consciousness can make better choices. But that doesn't mean you're making more consciousness. You're just giving consciousness more tools.
Well, I would say you're adding like each building block. Like let's say your vision, like your eyeball has a billion sensory neurons, and so I've got a billion pixels. Well, if I evolve another receptor, right? I've got a billion receptors. If I evolve another receptor, I've got an additional pixel, and so you can increase how many pixels you get or decrease it based on the quantity of materialistic receptors.
Those are all valuable. I agree with that. I just think it's not creating new consciousness. That's not what you're saying. You're saying that you're getting more access. You're getting more the consciousness is getting more access to better data.
I don't think there's a difference between consciousness and pixels. So if I have 100 pixels, I have 100 units of consciousness. If I have 200 pixels, I now have doubled my consciousness from 100 to 200.
Yeah, I don't even get that. I don't understand how does that work? Because now you're talking about thoughts. Are you saying consciousness are thoughts or something? The idea of red ideas?
Consciousness is the awareness of qualia, and qualia are the units of sensation. So if I have a unit of redness, if I'm aware I can see 1 red pixel, I have 1 unit of consciousness because I'm aware of that red thing. And if I have 1,000 of them, I'm aware of 1,000 different pixels.
Okay, I can see how you're using that, but that's exactly how a robot works. And so then you're saying that robots are producing consciousness.
But it begs the question why.
Well,
it begs the question why you have an awareness of it versus a robot, doesn't.
Yes, that is a very valuable question, but that is a really big tangent. I don't know if we want to go there.
Steve, I don't know how much time you have. Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah.
Well, we should go ahead.
Yeah, just still, I want to go back to the point that, to me, just so you know, my perspective, the materialists have answered a lot of observational questions. There's a lot of deductive reasoning that we're looking at this, but it reminds me of dark matter and dark energy, which is the most massive portion of all the material and energy in the universe, if we want to put it that way in those words. I think also your explanation and the explanations you're providing in the material world are similarly explaining, this piece that we see now. But to me, the 99% of the explanation is missing, which is where the laws of physics came from in the first place, and where this energy and from energy material came from in the first place. Without that entire bottom, to me, it's lacking the vast majority of the explanation. And so it's just, we're seeing this and we're having these observations, but it has no real explanatory power to me.
Yeah. We're dealing with extremely foundational and very hard to empirically test claims. And so the problem I see with like your perspective is that you're just it's kind of just an assertion. You're like, well, I like, nobody knows what's going on here, but like this explanation, I'm just gonna, it feels good, so I'm just gonna assert that this works. You know what I mean? There's a lot of problems with just asserting that there's a collection of intelligent minds are voting on reality. Like, where did these minds come from? Like, why are there many? How many are there? What are their values? Where did those values come from? Why are they eternal? What are their properties? Like, there's
you got to read
there's a lot of unknowns that are not even addressed.
You got to read the Sefer Yetzirah. You got to read the Midrash. You got to know the Kabbalah. You got to understand how the parts of the being come together to make mind. You have to understand why it's important, like why our spirit going through material, because that's your big thing. You're like, material existence is important, and it is, but that is creating these minds. And the idea again is you have to stop starting it at the end. You're starting it with this collective of beings that are materially created. And if you could not see it that way at all once, then you'd probably be able to see this idea of the infinite energy as a whole that's separate from the material. And you're saying it's like a democracy of spirits that are voting to make the material. That's not the way it works, right? There is a singular infinite, and it's becoming many, right?
And one thing I'd say too is that I don't feel like, at least, that I'm making assertions, right? The entire point of the presentation was using inductive logic to say we know that we are here, we have experiential phenomenon, the differentiated definable phenomenon. There is a reality. That's where I started. The premise is starting that there is a reality with differentiably definable attributes in it.
Yeah.
That must go down a causal chain where I went all the way down to boundaryless potential, and then how that boundaryless potential could be built back up into an actualized reality. So to me, there's no like axiom or priori, assumptions. It's based on starting with reality itself and using inductive logic all the way through.
The problem is, where does mind come from? You're just asserting minds exist, and I'm saying no, they don't.
No, that's
minds do not exist. You have to build them.
Out of consciousness.
The minds come from boundaryless potential and the necessity of the recursive process to actualize reality. That is the definition of consciousness. Like, there is no other way to actualize reality from boundaryless potential other than observation.
Bruh, it's Hegel. It's Hegel's Geist. Thesis, antithesis. You need to have all of it. You can't have one part of it without the rest of it. Mind's happening because spirit is using matter.
Yeah, and I'd agree they're all interdependent, but at the bottom level is boundaryless potential that can only collapse. So you can think of the material reality as the scratch pad of mind. Like, this is the test area of what we're trying to create, and the consciousness is interacting with the scratch pad to select laws. And you could also think of it as the universe is asking itself, what am I? And the response is, I am. And that question and answer is reality. The answer.
Seth's so uncomfortable. It's great. He's like,
the answer is also in the question. That's what's unique about it. It's like the process of discovering what I am is also what reality is.
You're like Dorothy pouring water on the Witch of the West right now. Like, calm down, you bully. No.
It's such like, to me, okay, it's such a weird argument to the universe is so mechanical. There's like so much clockwork to it to say, we're choosing, the universe is discovering itself. It's like, well, we want to be atoms and we want to create nuclear energy. When we split, we just have a desire to explode. It's like, where did that desire come from? That doesn't make any sense. That these spirits,
the desire to actualize reality, that's where it comes from.
It's like there's these spirits that are like, we really want to be like little orbitals in space, and like, well, we like the noble gases, that feels great, and but if you split us in half, we like to explode all of our boundless potential. Like, it's such an anthropomorphization of nature. Like, it adds like way too much like stuff on top of, like, nature is dumb. That's what needs to be conveyed. There's no feelings. There's no like complex cognition. The atom isn't looking into the universe and saying, what a pretty universe that I live with. That's just anthropomorphization. The
No,
atom,
it's not the atom. It's the quantum entanglement of pentaquarks. You're saying again, it's energy that's arranging itself in only so many ways, and those ways are all relation to itself. And it's not like all of these little spirit orbs. Those are the things that are made from this whole. So the whole from energy becoming many is then building back up into more specific, more complicated systems, right? And so because just because things are socializing, it should give you the idea that that is nature, that they were originally socialized and they're returning back to order.
It's such a bad argument, because these values.
I'm not personifying it. I'm just saying, okay.
The fundamental value system is the biggest problem. It's like, well, why do all of these spirits agree that atoms are the correct representation
you're doing
of reality?
You're doing it again. You're making it into all of these spirits instead of the singular spirit.
Well, Steve believes it's a collection. I don't care if it's
Do you think it started? Do you think it started out, Steve? Do you think it started out as one singular, like all things come from one singular spirit, or not? Or did it start out as many spirits?
Well, it depends on which angle you're looking at it from. There's a unified, collective consciousness that is all that is.
But is that emergent, or is that the source of all that is what it comes from?
You could say it's emergent in the sense that it's from boundaryless potential that is recursively analyzing itself to be able to actualize, to discover itself.
But that's singular, right? Or are you saying that that's many?
Well, it's working together as a collective of individuals, like an infinite number of individuals. So the collective is,
Mormon theology requires a collective. That's the problem.
Well, it's not only a problem; it's also a problem of consciousness itself. You have to have an other to explore against. So that's the necessity of for awareness to have being. There must be other to explore, which is why there's all the diversity of life that there is for the universe to discover itself.
Right. So here's another problem with idealism. It's the consistency problem. Like the materialists, they have a really easy answer to consistency. Like there are laws of physics. The universe functions according to the clockwork of physics. So why do atoms function the same way now as they did a million years ago? It's because of the clockwork of physics. It's because of laws. Under idealism, you have to be like, well, we wanted atoms to operate this way, and a million years later, we still want them to operate this way. And like this whole idea of just wanting things is so arbitrary. It doesn't make any sense.
But it's not arbitrary in the sense that not everything can coexist. Not all laws can be chosen to create a self-sustained, eternal, infinite universe.
Why don't they just tweak the laws whenever? Why don't the spirits get giddy and they're like, well, we want to explore new laws of physics. Like we're bored of the old clockwork. We want some new clockwork. Like why not?
I do think that this universe is, just one part of a beginning and end, but I think it's just one universe of an infinite number of universe, all that as a collective reality. And I do think that everything that can exist in a self-existent, sustainable universe does and will exist an infinite number of times. So your idea that we want to explore other possibilities, if it is actually possible to exist in a self-sustained universe, I think consciousness will do that. I think it actually will.
So God basically creates many world hypothesis, multiple realities.
If you think about a video game, you have to have certain rules for the game to function. Like if your character is platforming on a screen, like set it to, if I push the right key, true, that they move on the X coordinate like +10 as is held down. And if it was different than that, and if it was not true, then the game would break. You can have different games with different rules, but a game, people have been playing Super Mario Brothers for 40 years, and there's millions of ways to do it. It's always changing. People are finding quicker ways.
The problem is you can't have a oh, sorry, go ahead.
You're making the same mistake, Andreas. Video games are top-down causation. Our universe is not based on top-down causation. It's based on bottom-up causation.
Well, that's just an assertion.
Yeah,
that's how everything works in science. everything.
that's the major presumption of science that philosophers will look at and say you're accepting that wholesale, and that actually has no fundamental premise. It's just an assumption.
Not just
No,
philosophers. I feel like
it's-
if you just were like a student and you took like a SEM course, you know, like if you just like looked at any of the nanostructures and just saw how crazy sacred geometric nanostructures are, it's not just some weird wobbly pattern of, I thought, you know, this looks like some sort of thoughtful, that's the best way to describe nature, is it's very thoughtful, right?
No, absolutely not.
And
I think
want
it's
to-
completely, yeah. Look at like a
How-
amino acid protein fold.
That's purely mathematical. It's just following physics, and the math of physics makes a shape. It's like, oh, if I have 4 sides, I make a square. Like, you don't need a thought. You don't need thoughts to make a square. You just need math, right?
Dude, if you could find, I mean, I don't know. Only the most brilliant people are trying to understand tertiary structures and polypeptides. I don't really think that it's just so simple. I disagree. It's thoughtful. Nature's super thoughtful.
Do you think that there's math behind electromagnetic forces?
See, that's the other thing. Like, what do you mean when you say math versus thought? Because now math to me sounds like awareness.
Are there equations? Are there mathematical equations within physics that predict the future of electromagnetic particles?
Yeah, to an extent, and only because of AI recently.
So,
but that's
if,
the more we can predict is teleology using.
Electromagnetic particles, they come together, and if the math says make a square, isn't it just the math making them go into a square shape?
Yeah, but that's because the laws were chosen.
Yeah, I mean, those are crazy laws, dude. That's a crazy thing to happen.
Yeah.
One video I wanted to recommend to you guys that I had been watching. I can send you the link. It's called "Mathematical Challenges to Darwin's Theory of Evolution." This is a conversation like 5 years ago between David Berlinski, David Gerlenter, and Stephen Meyer, who are all coming from different perspectives, but agree that on looking at the details more closely, like random chance and Darwin's theory of survival of fittest alone with like 1 in something like 2 to the 70th power chance that the math works out. It's an argument against a dumb development of the world, and I think this is just applying to evolution itself, which I agree existed, but they're showing it can exist mathematically. It doesn't look like it can exist independently of intelligence as was originally thought. And I would say the same is true of the universe. We just have these base assumptions, but I think the more knowledge that we have, the more we start to really run the numbers on these things, we're going to find, in my opinion, like we're finding with Darwin's theory, that it's not sufficient enough without begging an explanation that ultimately is going to point to intelligence. So I'll send you that link. I think you'd find it really interesting, and you could rebut it in another conversation.
Yeah, I'm aware of it, but yeah, feel free to just send it to me.
And just read all the Teilhard Chardin's books until you get it. Everybody, that's not just Seth. Everybody needs to read Teilhard Chardin. The Omega Point, bruh. Well, I gotta get ready for my next show. Is there anything else you guys want to cover this time? We can do another one.
Well, yeah, I think it would be fair for Seth, for you to lay out, if you want, another time to lay. I went through my whole presentation where I felt like I laid out my bottom up argument, and you said you need another hour and a half for yours, and so
let's set that up. We can do that.
I can just do a closing statement. Is that what you mean?
Yeah, but also we should definitely do like tomorrow, next day, or sometime this week if you guys have time. Let's do another full rebuttal episode. But yeah, go ahead.
Oh boy. Yeah, so like
I don't want to cut you off.
Yeah, to me it seems like obvious that materialism, I mean, like not materialism in the super reductive sense. Obviously consciousness exists, but materialism in the sense that like the particle relationships are extremely important to how reality is. I don't think reality is this arbitrary, dreamed up, voted on consensus. That doesn't make sense. You need an explanation for all of these minds that are creating reality. There is no explanation for that. I don't buy the explanation that they just kind of recursively exist.
Reality is a conspiracy theory. Sorry, I couldn't help it.
And the problem, the most fundamental problem, is that minds are emergent. They are too complex to be fundamental, because fundamental things are dumb and minds are not dumb. So you can't just say, oh, I've got this really smart mind that's fundamental. It's like, that doesn't make sense. If you've got a complex thing, that complex thing is made of building blocks, and those building blocks give it its complexity. And so that just pushes the problem back. If there are fundamental minds, then we've got to have fundamental materials behind those minds. So based on everything we know about science, our decisions are based on it's based on our brain. To me, it's absolutely clear from neuroscience that whatever our brain is doing, it's producing our decisions. If you damage the brain, you damage our ability to decide things. If you enhance the brain, you enhance our ability to decide things. If you augment the brain, you augment our ability to decide things. Like, everything in conscious experience is extremely tightly tied to the nature of the brain. If you play with the materials of the brain, you're necessarily warping and augmenting consciousness. So the link, to me, it's absolutely clear. Materials are producing the consciousness. Materials are producing the decision. And the problem is, from a free will perspective, we know that all of these materials are following the laws of physics. They're not following the arbitrary whims of some idealistic consciousness. These are consistent things. They're laws. They're not arbitrary. And because the materials are following these laws, that means determinism is controlling the brain. And if determinism is controlling the brain, then determinism is also controlling our decisions. And that just means we are basically slaves to the laws of physics. And we can have these conscious experiences. We can have the feeling of deciding, but we are just witnessing our own mechanics. Our mechanics are moving. There's the magnetism of our materials. The electricity is following the path of least resistance. Okay, the electricity goes over here to decide this. Okay, now the electricity goes over here to decide this. We feel like we're making all these choices, but we're just following the laws of physics that is operating on those flows of electricity. And so I don't think algorithms are escapable, and algorithms are fundamentally robotic. The brain, all these electric algorithms, that's exactly what robots do. In fact, artificial intelligence, it was designed to mimic the brain. And that's like a whole nother conversation. But it's fascinating how by telling the software to mimic the brain, we created, smart software. What it shows is that the material algorithms are creating the intelligence. We can take our material algorithms, we can duplicate it over on software, and we can output a similar result. And so to me, it's extremely obvious that it's a bottom-up process. You evolve the materials, you evolve the intelligence, you evolve the consciousness. It's not fundamental because that doesn't make any sense.
That off to me?
So I have to deal with Seth. I'm sorry. Go on, Steve.
Oh, no worries. So to me, the biggest flaw in Seth's worldview and others like him, which is shared by a lot of people, is this idea that it's so obvious that material creates the consciousness, and it's this bottom up way of building up the universe. And I do agree that this materialistic, atheistic worldview has become so ingrained in our culture that we think that it can just be safely assumed as if it has been proven. I think this is a scientism. I think I'm saying that word wrong.
No, that's great.
Yeah. Scientism is the right word. That is too arrogant in its worldview and unquestioning of its worldview, because what I see when you go down to the base of it, there's no explanation no even real theory or explanation for where this material energy comes from. It just exists. Where the laws come from, again, other than the I'm forgetting the word again. I keep wanting to say anthropomorphic, but that's not what I'm.
Anthropomorphization?
Not anthropomorphic. No, it's not the word I mean. The
Oh,
anthropic principle.
yeah.
Anthropic principle has been the best that has been done, but over time we realized that begs the question: why this one in gazillion chance that it's this here? It still begs the question, and to my understanding, there's been no bottom-up explanation, but of all these prior necessary causes in a supposedly clockwork deterministic universe. There's no origin story. And so I think what I have provided is not just some idea of conscious beings at their whim, creating random laws, but rather a fundamental necessity out of an origin, and this origin being boundaryless potential, that the laws, there is an explanation for the laws, which is that they're selected for because reality is everywhere the choice to exist. And if I didn't make it clear before, something you said caught my attention. I also think this consciousness is integrally tied with our material world. I think this mortal realm, as I want to put it in, and LDS terminology, is absolutely essential for consciousness to have existed. Like there's an interdependent relationship that exists there. It's only that you're seeing that interdependent relationship as material first. What I'm saying is that consciousness, the base composition of consciousness is more fundamental than the material reality, but there's a codependent relationship.
The Ein Sof, it's called.
And that interaction with the material reality, which is ultimately itself, it's a manifestation of itself, is an exploration of itself, that it can create the infinite reality that we can experience all that is. I don't think it's a dumb universe. I do think the universe has a teleology, and that teleology is governed by an intelligence that has an ultimate purpose. And I think the more we learn, we see that the universe has a purpose, which is ultimately to exist, to not go to death, to separate the light from the darkness, to put truth into existence, and to put paradox and lie back to darkness.
Right.
In religious words, put evil back to darkness. And even speaking of LDS theology, through the atonement, to be able to ascend above this darkness, and for all of us to manifest our true and full natures, which is all truth. Ultimately, all of us have that potential of all truth and actualized reality. The fact that we're living here is evidence that we are among the gods, that we are both the creator and the created, participating in this universe and everything that is. And so I think that's the most beautiful story that exists. And I think the logic points to it, and the science and all things point to the same narrative in the end, as far as everything that I've seen.
Seth, imagine you're living in a big video game machine. You got these AI robots everywhere. No. Let's take it even easier. Let's say that you have a computer, and in your computer, you have some AI programs, and you've never given them any data sets yet, right? They're just like they're able to process them, but it's all zeros waiting for ones, And as you give it more data, then it's able to process that data. If you look at that video game engine idea, or even better, like if you try to change any of the laws of physics, we would end up in an apocalyptic scenario much sooner than we have yet. It seems like things are going really well because of the rules that we have, which are allowing for the world to still exist because of physics. The things have not expanded apart. Things are held together. We don't just have sand. We have diamonds. Life continues on. And they've done experiments also with viruses where they've taken 7,000 or more different kinds of viruses, and they've put them in vats and evolved them quickly, and only 47 or so make it, right? So you can mess with the rules of things, but the rules of things in material seem to be like here because that's what allows for the longest perpetuation of a material reality in this system. I think that's what's going on. And then from there, in a dream, you can dream anything. Like once you've experienced that and you've had all of these material experiences, then the consciousness can do anything with that, but only once it's gone through actually seeing and experiencing and knowing all of these material experiences. So you have to go. I don't know. You feel uncomfortable.
I have to address this now. Now we've got to go.
I was worried we were going to go below 3 hours, and that would have been crazy. Do it.
So like the appeal to like the universe, to me, this is also a bad argument because like if you look into the universe, it's actually the opposite of what you guys are saying. It's not like teeming with potential and life. It's just teeming with hostile forces. Like if at the beginning of the Big Bang, there's these consciousnesses that are like, we want to create existence. We want to maximize existing potential. You would think that every planet would be inhabitable. There'd be plants growing everywhere. There'd be all these aliens everywhere. That's the opposite of what we observe. What we observe is cold, harsh, poisonous, hot climates that are completely hostile to existence. And it's just like the life forms on Earth just like barely eke out existence. Like we're an anomaly. It's not like everything is designed for us to exist. It's like like this.
Thank you for furthering my point.
We're like this. We're like this accidental algorithm that like figured out how to replicate itself. It's like, okay, we can barely exist. And like 90% of species are going extinct. And it's like that we're just struggling to exist. It's not like if consciousness was trying to imagine, let's create the most friendly laws of physics so that we can experience boundless potential. That's not what we observe.
I would also agree with that. Yeah. I don't think it's just here to be heaven on earth. No, I agree.
Yeah.
It's actually supposed to be a bummer sometimes.
Yeah, because it's exploring all possibilities, right? In some sense, like even though this manifests instantaneously, there is some sort of bottom-up evolution that has to exist for the universe to understand itself. And if you have limitless time and space, I mean, I don't think it's
I would take a nap first, wouldn't you? I wouldn't go anywhere the first day.
You wouldn't need to optimize it or something like you're almost out of space, like to life should be here, and I want to put life in every single optimize. Like if you have limitless time and space, it's not necessary, right? The value of something, it shouldn't be seen as like, okay, looking at this time and space and the consciousness that exists right here, that is evidence that it's an accident. Like we have all the space and time that we want to use, so why not create all the variations that are possible, and then over in the variation that's most important to develop, into higher levels of being. And so that's my view.
Fair enough.
I love you guys. All right, well, let's do it again really soon. A little bit more of that here. It's been really fun. And here's the part where it goes, "Hail to the prophet!" I love you guys. We'll see you next time.
Yeah, thanks for the conversation. Thanks for digging in for so long.
Good job, Steve.
Let's do it again in a few days.
Okay.